Before we get into tonight's story, a huge thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting this one. If you're watching, we see you and we genuinely appreciate you being part of this community. And to everyone else here tonight, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are and what time it is for you right now. It never gets old seeing just how far this community spans. Someone's listening at 2 a.m. in Tokyo, someone else is on their lunch break in London, someone's falling asleep in Sao Paulo. Every time we ask, it reminds us that this little corner of the internet reaches further than we ever expected. So tell us where you are. We'll be reading every single one. Now, let's get into it. You're 31,000 feet above the Atlantic, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, and somewhere in the galley behind you, a man in a uniform is standing very still. The flight attendant who sees him first assumes he's a deadheading crew member hitching a ride to Miami. She smiles. He doesn't smile back. He says very quietly, "Watch the hydraulics tonight." And then he simply isn't there anymore. She checks the cabin. She checks the galley. She checks her own memory, replaying the 30 seconds over and over like a tape she cannot stop rewinding. Later, when she describes this to a colleague, she's shown a photograph from a memorial service, and she goes very pale. The man she saw died 8 months earlier. His name was Donald Repo, and he was the flight engineer aboard Eastern Airlines Flight 401. But here is what the official history will never tell you. What she witnessed that night was not a ghost. It was a recording. A residual echo of a human mind pressed into the circuits of a machine during the worst moment of its owner's life. And the people who built that machine knew it was possible. They just never expected it to actually work. Welcome to Sleep Theories. Tonight we're going somewhere very dark, very real, and very far from anything you were taught to believe about the boundaries between human consciousness and the technology we build to carry us through the sky. Act 1. The Crash Section. December 29th, 1972, 11:42 in the evening. The night is clear over southern Florida, the kind of clear that makes you trust the sky. Below the approaching aircraft, the Everglades stretch for miles in every direction, black and silent and utterly indifferent to anything that might fall into them. Eastern Airlines, Flight 401 is a Lockheed L1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced commercial aircraft in the world at the time, a wide-body tri-engine jetliner that Lockheed built to compete with the Boeing 747 and the Douglas DC-10. It is beautiful in the way that serious engineering is always beautiful. It is powerful. It is, by every available measure, safe. The aircraft departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York earlier that evening with 163 passengers and crew on board. The route is routine. Miami is one of the most heavily trafficked destinations in American aviation. The crew has flown it dozens of times. Captain Robert Loft is 55 years old and has logged 32 years of flying experience. He is by all accounts a steady, professional, deeply capable pilot, the kind of man who makes everyone around him feel calmer simply by being present. First Officer Albert Stockstill is 39, experienced, careful. Flight Engineer Donald Repo is 51, an Air Force veteran with decades behind him. These are not careless men. These are not distracted men. These are exactly the kind of men you want in the cockpit of a 180-ton aircraft descending toward one of the busiest airports in the country. The approach to Miami International begins normally, gear down, checklist running. And then, at 11:42 in the evening, something small and stupid and catastrophic happens. A single landing gear indicator light, a small amber bulb no larger than your thumbnail, fails to illuminate. The gear may or may not be locked in the down position. The crew cannot tell. This is not an emergency, not yet, but it requires attention. Captain Loft contacts Miami Approach Control and requests permission to enter a holding pattern over the Everglades while the crew investigates. Permission is granted. The autopilot is engaged. The aircraft levels out at 2,000 feet and begins to circle in the dark. For the next 77 seconds, 3 experienced aviation professionals focus their attention on a light bulb. They try removing it and reinserting it. They send Repo down into the avionics bay beneath the cockpit to visually inspect the gear through a small viewing port. They talk through possibilities. They are thorough, methodical, and completely absorbed. And while they are absorbed, the autopilot slips. Not dramatically. Not with any warning. Someone, investigators will later theorise it was an accidental contact with the control column, bumps the altitude selector, and the aircraft begins a slow, nearly imperceptible descent. The altimeter readings change. No alarm sounds. The rate of descent is gentle enough that no one feels it. And in the darkness over the Everglades, 2,000 feet of altitude quietly become 1,000, become 500, become 103. At 11:42 and 12 seconds, the left wingtip of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 contacts the surface of the Florida Everglades at approximately 348 miles per hour. The aircraft disintegrates across a stretch of sawgrass and shallow water, roughly 18 miles west-northwest of Miami International Airport. 101 people die. 77 survive, some of them pulled from the wreckage by airboat crews within the first hour. The dead include Captain Robert Loft and Flight Engineer Donald Repo. First Officer Albert Stockstill dies shortly after impact. In the investigation that follows, the National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause to be the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final stages of the approach, leading to an inadvertent loss of altitude. The crew became distracted by a malfunctioning indicator light. The autopilot descended. The plane flew into the earth. Official cause: pilot distraction. Case closed. That is the story you are meant to remember, but there is another story. It begins in the sawgrass, in the hours after the crash, with the salvage teams and the engineers who came with them, and it does not end until something inside a machine learns to speak. Section 2. The recovery. The Florida Everglades are not a forgiving environment for anything, least of all an aircraft investigation. The terrain is a labyrinth of sawgrass, cypress and shallow water that can rise to your chest in the wrong spot and drop to your ankles 10 feet later. Alligators move through the reeds at night. The humidity is staggering, even in December. The wreckage of Flight 401 is scattered across an area roughly half a mile wide and more than a mile long, interleaved with bodies and luggage and the intimate debris of 163 lives interrupted. The National Transportation Safety Board sends its GO team immediately. The Federal Aviation Administration sends observers. Eastern Airlines sends representatives. And from Burbank, California, Lockheed sends engineers. This is not, by itself, unusual. When a new aircraft suffers a catastrophic accident, the manufacturer wants people on the ground. They want to know what failed, what held, what the data recorders captured, the L10. One TriStar was fewer than 2 years into commercial service at the time of the Flight 401 accident, and Lockheed had a commercial and reputational interest in understanding what happened. Their engineers in the Everglades are expected. Their presence is noted and documented. What is less expected and considerably less documented is what happens with the salvage. In commercial aviation, when a crashed aircraft is not a total loss, when components can be recovered in serviceable condition, those components are evaluated, tested, and if approved, returned to service. This practice was standard in 1972 and remains standard today. It is economically rational, it is legally permitted, and it raises no ethical concerns in most circumstances. Most circumstances. The wreckage of Flight 401 is determined to contain a number of reusable components. Galley equipment, some structural fittings, hydraulic components, various avionic modules and electronic assemblies. Eastern Airlines, which is not a wealthy airline, and which operates a substantial fleet of L1011s, accepts the salvaged parts and distributes them across its aircraft. This is logged. This is routine. But buried within the salvage manifests, if you know how to read them, is something that is neither logged nor routine. Several avionics modules, specifically a cluster of signal processing and sensor integration units from the aircraft's forward electronics bay, are removed from the salvage pool before Eastern's maintenance teams take custody. They do not go to Eastern Airlines. They are transferred directly, under the supervision of the Lockheed engineers, to a separate facility. The chain of custody documentation, which should specify a destination, contains instead a reference number that does not correspond to any Lockheed maintenance or engineering facility on record. The modules simply disappear from the paper trail, and 3 months later, the first apparition appears. Aced 2. The Hauntings Begin, Section 3, Spring 1973, first sightings you have. To understand the culture of commercial aviation in the early 1970s, to understand why what happened next was so thoroughly and effectively buried. Airlines were hierarchical institutions with rigid chains of command. Flight attendants did not contradict captains. Junior crew members did not file unofficial reports about impossible things. And nobody talked to the press about anything that might make the flying public question the safety of the machines that kept the airlines solvent. The industry had been through a brutal stretch of accidents in the late 1960s. Public confidence was a fragile, precious thing. You did not chip away at it with ghost stories, and yet the stories came. The first documented sighting occurs on a Miami to Atlanta flight in the spring of 1973, approximately 4 months after the crash. A senior flight attendant performing her pre-departure galley check notices a man in an Eastern Airlines flight, engineer's uniform, standing near the aft galley station. She assumes he's a commuting crew member travelling on a jump seat. She approaches him to verify his credentials, standard procedure, and he turns to look at her. She describes his expression as calm, almost professional, as if he is in the middle of an inspection. He says, clearly and quietly, "There is a problem with the number 2 galley oven heating element. Check it before departure." She turns to look at the oven. When she turns back, the man is gone. The galley is empty. She checks the oven. The heating element has developed a fault that, left unaddressed, would have created a fire risk at altitude. The flight is briefly delayed for maintenance. She files a standard report about the galley fault. She does not at first mention the man. Later that evening, going through the crash memorial materials that circulate internally at Eastern in those months, a quiet way of honouring the dead, she sees his photograph. It's Donald Repo, 51 years old, flight engineer, Eastern Airlines. Died December 29th, 1972, Florida Everglades. She recognises him immediately. She goes home and does not sleep. The second sighting is reported by a different flight attendant on a different L1011 operating the same Miami route, approximately 6 weeks after the first. This crew member encounters a figure she initially takes to be the captain standing in the forward galley doorway. He's looking at the cockpit door with an expression she describes as concentrated, as though he's running through calculations. He says, without turning to face her, "Watch the autopilot altitude hold tonight. Check the setting before descent." Then he is not there. She reports this to the captain, who is shaken enough to perform an unscheduled autopilot system check before the descent into Miami. The altitude hold function is discovered to have been improperly set. The aircraft would have begun an unnoticed descent during approach. She is later shown photographs. The man she saw was Captain Robert Loft, and so it begins. Not a single dramatic event, but a slow accumulation of impossible encounters, each one specific, each one actionable, each one followed within minutes or hours by the discovery of a genuine mechanical issue that the apparition had identified. Hydraulic warnings preceded by a figure in the cockpit jump seat, who calmly recites component numbers. Navigation discrepancies flagged by a presence in the avionics bay that vanishes before the maintenance crew arrives, but leaves behind a marked checklist that no one remembers placing there. Electrical faults in galley units, pressurization anomalies, fuel system irregularities. In every case, in every single documented case, the crew acts on the warning. In every case, the fault is real. The dead crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 are not haunting their airline, they are doing their jobs. Section 4. Multiple witnesses, one impossible pattern. What makes the Flight 401 sightings historically extraordinary? What separates them from the vast ocean of ghost stories that crash investigators and airline personnel collect over careers is the specificity of the pattern. Most reported apparitions in aviation history are vague, a shape, a feeling, a shadow in a doorway, the kind of sensory ambiguity that the human brain, running on 3 hours of sleep at 35,000 feet, generates with impressive regularity. The Flight 4 01 sightings are nothing like this. Over the course of roughly 14 months, from early 1973 through mid-1974, Eastern Airlines accumulates somewhere between 12 and 30 separate witness reports, depending on whose records you consult. The range is wide because the collection of reports was itself irregular, inconsistent, and in some cases actively disrupted, but the reports that do survive share characteristics that are, from an investigative standpoint, genuinely remarkable. First, the witnesses. These are not passengers, not civilians, not individuals with reason to embellish or incentive to attract attention. These are experienced aviation professionals, pilots with thousands of hours of flight time, flight attendants with years of service, maintenance technicians with technical training. Multiple witnesses hold ATP certificates, the highest credential available to American pilots. These are people trained to observe accurately under pressure, people whose professional reputations depend on clear, reliable reporting. Their accounts are specific in their descriptions of the apparitions, specific in the warnings delivered, and specific in the subsequent discoveries that confirm the warnings were accurate. Second, the aircraft. When investigators later attempt to map the sightings against Eastern's L-1011 fleet, a pattern emerges that is too consistent to be coincidental. The apparitions appear almost exclusively on aircraft that were confirmed to contain salvage components from the Flight 401 wreckage. Aircraft that had not received any salvage parts generated no credible sightings at all. The correlation is not perfect. The salvage documentation is incomplete enough that some ambiguity remains, but the trend is unmistakable. Remove the parts, remove the sightings. Something specific to those particular components, those particular machines, is generating these encounters. Third, the content. The apparitions do not speak in riddles. They do not wander or weep or display the theatrical behaviours that ghost stories typically assign to the dead. They speak in the language of aviation professionals. They name components. They cite system numbers. They describe fault conditions using technical vocabulary that would be meaningless to a civilian but immediately actionable to a crew. Captain Loft in multiple accounts is described as reviewing something that witnesses cannot see, as though working from a checklist that exists somewhere slightly out of phase with the physical world. Donald Repo, in his most frequently reported appearances, seems to be conducting inspections. He moves through the galley with purpose. He examines equipment. He flags problems. He is, in other words, functioning exactly as a flight engineer should function on a pre-departure check. Except that he has been dead for months. One account, which circulates in aviation folklore but which several researchers have traced to a genuinely documented incident, describes Repo appearing to a captain in the cockpit of an L-1011 before a scheduled flight from New York. The captain, who knows about the crash but has not personally experienced any prior sightings, looks up from his pre-flight checks and sees a man in a flight engineer's uniform seated at the flight engineer's panel. The panel is active. The man is running through the flight engineer's pre-departure checklist with methodical, unhurried precision. The captain watches for a moment, then asks who he is. The man looks up and says, "You don't have to worry about the pre-flight. I've already completed it." Then he is gone. The captain verifies the panel. Every item on the flight engineer's checklist has been performed correctly. Section 5. Eastern Airlines Response. The corporate response to the Flight 401 sightings follows a playbook that, once you recognise it, you begin to see applied to inconvenient truths across many industries and many eras. It is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a room full of men in suits explicitly agreeing to suppress the truth. It is something quieter, and in some ways more troubling. An institution reflexively protecting itself from a reality it cannot process, using the tools of bureaucracy and social pressure to ensure that reality remains unpublicised. Eastern Airlines, in the early 1970s, is an airline under strain. Competition is intensifying. Fuel costs are rising. The crash itself has been expensive in both human and financial terms. The company cannot afford another blow to its public image. and it absolutely cannot afford to become the airline whose crash planes are apparently haunted. The response, when crew reports begin filtering up through the supervisory structure, is swift and consistent. Disbelief, discouragement, and documentation that subsequently goes missing. Flight attendants who report sightings are spoken to privately by supervisors and advised, with varying degrees of subtlety, that discussing unusual experiences aboard aircraft is not consistent with professional conduct. Pilots who mention the encounters in informal settings are reminded that flight crew medical certification can be jeopardized by reports of visual phenomena. The message is not quite explicit enough to constitute a formal order, but it is clear this is not something Eastern Airlines wants discussed, and the people who work for Eastern Airlines understand what the company wants. Several crew members later claim that written incident reports they filed, reports describing the apparitions and the subsequent mechanical discoveries, were removed from maintenance logs. This is a more serious allegation, one that implies active falsification of official records. Aviation maintenance logs are legal documents. Removing entries from them is not merely institutional self-protection, it is a federal offence. Whether this actually occurred, and to what degree, is impossible to verify completely because the primary evidence, the logs themselves, is what would have been altered. What can be verified is the pattern of what the logs do not contain. Maintenance records from Eastern L10. Ones during the sighting period show numerous instances of faults being discovered and corrected during pre-flight checks or early in flights, with the discovery attributed to routine inspection or crew observation. In several cases, the timing and specificity of the discoveries align closely with the sighting reports that do survive. The logs record the fault and the fix. They do not record the conversation with a dead man that prompted the inspection. Eastern's official stance on the rare occasions it is pressed is consistent. The sightings are unsubstantiated rumours, the product of grief, suggestion, and the natural human tendency to find patterns in random events. This is a position that, stated plainly, is not unreasonable. It is also a position that, maintained in the face of the specific, documented, technically accurate warnings that the apparitions delivered, begins to feel less like scepticism and more like a strategy. Act 3, the investigator section. 6. Eleanor Ruiz, present day. Eleanor Ruiz is not the kind of journalist who goes looking for ghost stories. She spends her professional life in the very unglamorous intersection of aviation safety and government documentation, writing the kind of deeply researched, carefully footnoted work that wins the respect of other aviation journalists and the attention of roughly 350 dedicated readers. She's meticulous, sceptical, and deeply allergic to the sensational. She has, over the course of a 12-year career, developed a reputation for being the person you call when you want someone to explain why a regulatory failure matters, not why a haunted airplane is scary. She is, in other words, exactly the wrong person to be drawn into the story of Flight 401. She finds it, as most significant discoveries are found, sideways. She's researching an entirely different story, a retrospective on Cold War aviation policy, and the ways in which military and civilian aviation programs intersected during the 1960s and 70s. When she encounters a reference she cannot immediately explain. Buried in a partially declassified Department of Defense archive, in a section dealing with contractor coordination for experimental aviation systems, is a single-line reference to an Eastern Airlines incident involving an L1011 aircraft and subsequent data collection that had been coordinated with the FAA and a Lockheed engineering division. The reference is dated January 1973, 2 weeks after the crash. The reference is unremarkable on its face. Aviation accidents generate data, and government agencies and manufacturers routinely coordinate on that data. But two details catch Ruiz's attention. The first is that the coordinating office on the Department of Defense side is not the standard aviation safety liaison. It is an office that, in the organisational charts of the period, sits under a directorate associated with human factors research, a field that, in DoD context, encompasses everything from cockpit ergonomics to the study of human performance under extreme stress. The second is that the reference cross-indexes with an FAA file number that Ruiz knows, from her broader research, corresponds to a category of documentation that the FAA used for experimental system evaluations, not accident reports. Experimental evaluations. She pulls the FAA file. It has been mostly redacted. What remains is a series of technical references to an avionics system designated by an alphanumeric code she does not recognise, installed in L1011 aircraft during a modification program in the early 1970s. The system is described, in the surviving language, as a crew state monitoring and environmental response integration unit. The description is bureaucratic enough to be nearly meaningless, and Ruiz, who has learned to read bureaucratic language the way a physician reads symptoms, recognises it immediately as precisely the kind of description designed to make something significant sound routine. She begins to dig. And digging, she discovers that the history of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is considerably stranger than any of the official accounts have suggested. Section 7. The Lockheed Connection. The Lockheed L1011 TriStar was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary technological achievement for its time. When it entered commercial service in 1972, it incorporated flight management and avionics systems that were genuinely at the frontier of what was commercially deployable. The aircraft's integrated central computer system, a networked arrangement of flight computers, navigation processors, and sensor fusion units, was more sophisticated than anything then flying in commercial aviation. It was, in important ways, a preview of the glass cockpit era that would arrive a decade later. But what the public documentation of the L1011 describes, and what the actual engineering program involved, are not quite the same thing. Lockheed's avionics work on the TriStar in the early 1970s was part of a broader research effort that stretched from commercial aviation into defence contracting, and, less visibly, into something that could be described as early human-machine interface science. The engineers working on the TriStar's avionics were not merely solving the practical problems of integrating flight systems. Some of them were pursuing questions that, stated plainly, sound more like philosophy than engineering. Questions about how human decision-making interacts with automated systems under extreme conditions. Questions about what information the human brain communicates to its environment, through voice, through motion, through the electrical patterns of its activity, during moments of catastrophic stress. The centralized flight computer on the L1011 was not merely a navigation and automation tool. It was also, in certain configurations, an observer. It monitored the cockpit, environment continuously. It recorded not just flight data, but crew interaction data. How often pilots touched controls, what voice frequencies they used, how their behavioural patterns shifted during different phases of flight. Some of this was for the entirely legitimate purpose of cockpit ergonomics research, understanding how to design interfaces that were less fatiguing and more intuitive. But some of it was something else. Some of it was part of a program that did not appear in any public engineering documentation. Ruiz learns about the program from a source she will describe, in her eventual published work, only as a retired senior Lockheed avionics technician who worked on L1011 systems integration from 1970 through 1974. The man is elderly when Ruiz finds him. He is not looking for attention. He is, she will later write, primarily motivated by the desire to tell someone who will understand what he is telling them. He contacts her through a circuitous route after reading one of her smaller published pieces on Cold War aviation technology, a piece that demonstrates, he tells her, that she knows how to read between lines. Act 4, the Hidden Program section. 8. Project Aware. He calls it Project Aware. He's not certain that is the official designation. He worked on a specific technical subsystem and did not have visibility into the program's full scope, but that is the name his team used internally, and it is the name that appears on the internal documentation he accessed during his time on the project. He describes the program's origins as a product of several converging pressures in the late 1960s. Aviation accidents were increasing, the industry was growing rapidly, and the relationship between human pilots and increasingly automated aircraft systems was generating a new category of accident that investigators struggled to classify clearly. The problem was not that pilots were incompetent. The problem was that highly competent, highly experienced pilots were failing to interact effectively with automated systems during critical phases of flight. They were trusting the automation when they should have been questioning it. They were questioning it when they should have been trusting it. The boundary between human and machine decision-making had become a fault line. Project Aware was, at its most fundamental level, an attempt to understand that fault line from the inside. Not by studying pilot performance after accidents, which was the standard approach, but by instrumenting the cockpit environment during normal and abnormal operations in ways that would capture information about pilot cognition in real time. The crew state monitoring components that Lockheed installed in certain L1011 aircraft during the early 1970s were not merely recording behavioural data. They were attempting to capture something more fundamental, the electrical and acoustic environment of the cockpit, the micro-variations in voice pattern that correlate with cognitive load, the patterns of physical interaction with controls that, the researchers hypothesized, might serve as a legible record of what the pilot's nervous system was doing at any given moment. The hypothesis underlying the more ambitious arm of Project Aware was this, that under conditions of extreme stress, the human nervous system communicates with its environment in ways that go beyond the obvious channels of voice and physical action. That the electrical and electromagnetic patterns generated by a brain in crisis, operating at the absolute limit of its capacity, processing catastrophic information at maximum speed, might under the right conditions leave some kind of imprint on the electronic systems in its immediate environment. Not a mystical imprint, not a supernatural one, a physical imprint, an electromagnetic recording, the same way a voice leaves a pattern on magnetic tape. This was not accepted science. Ruiz is careful to make this clear. The researchers involved in this arm of the project were working at the outer boundary of what any rigorous scientific framework of the period would have endorsed, and they knew it. They were not, in their own conception of the work, doing parapsychology or consciousness research in any recognised sense. They were doing speculative electromagnetic biology, exploring the possibility that sufficiently advanced signal processing systems might detect and record neurological patterns through the electromagnetic emissions of a living brain in extreme states. They did not know if it would work. Most of them, privately, did not expect it to. Then, Flight 401 happened. Section 9. The salvaged components. The aircraft that became Eastern Airlines. Flight 401 had been modified as part of the Aware instrumentation program within the 6 months prior to the accident. The modifications were subtle by design. The experimental components were integrated into existing avionics housings, their presence obscured by the normal complexity of the aircraft's electronic systems. The flight crew had no knowledge of them. Eastern's maintenance teams had no documentation distinguishing them from standard system components. Only the Lockheed engineers and the project team knew which specific units carried the experimental hardware. When the aircraft struck the Everglades on December 29, 1972, something happened that the Aware researchers had not predicted and could not, in the aftermath, fully explain. The crash scenario was, in some respects, an extreme version of exactly the conditions the project was designed to study. 3 experienced pilots facing a crisis they do not fully understand, operating at the absolute limit of their cognitive capacity, interacting intensely with the aircraft systems in the final seconds before impact. The electromagnetic environment in the cockpit during those seconds was, by any measure, extraordinary. The aircraft's electrical systems were drawing maximum power. The crew was in a state of acute physiological and neurological stress, and the Aware recording hardware, installed in units that were reinforced beyond normal flight specifications, precisely because data integrity during abnormal operations was a research priority, was running. When the Lockheed engineers reached the salvage site and extracted the experimental components, they found that the recording hardware had survived the impact. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but functionally. The units were damaged but not destroyed, and the data they contained, the electromagnetic record of the cockpit environment in the final minutes and seconds of Flight 401, was partially intact. What that data showed, according to the technician Ruiz interviews, is the reason the units were removed from the salvage pool and transferred to a secure facility rather than returned to Eastern Airlines. The signal processing systems had not merely captured audio and behavioural data. They had captured something that the analysis team, working through the winter of 1972 and into 1973, could not easily classify. Patterns. Complex, layered, non-random electromagnetic patterns that did not correspond to any of the environmental or equipment sources that standard analysis would identify. Patterns that, when the analysis team applied the signal processing algorithms they had developed for pilot state monitoring, produced outputs that were structurally similar in their complexity, in their organisation, in their apparent responsiveness to modelled inputs, to the neural activity profiles they had been accumulating from live pilot studies. The crew's final electromagnetic signatures were still in the hardware, something that functioned within the limits of what the technology could detect and represent, like a recording of what those three men's minds were doing in the moment of their death. The technician is quiet for a long moment after he tells Ruiz this. Then he says, "We didn't know what we had made. We didn't know it could do that. And when we found out it could, we didn't know what to do with it." Section 10. The theory emerges. Here is where the story requires you to hold two things in your mind at once. Two things that seem, by the conventions of the world you grew up in, to be mutually exclusive. The first is this. Everything that follows is mechanistic. Nothing in the Flight 401 story requires you to abandon your understanding of the physical world, to accept the existence of souls or spirits or anything that classical physics cannot in principle accommodate. The aware researchers were not studying the supernatural. They were studying electromagnetism and neurophysiology and signal processing. Their apparatus was hardware. Their findings were data. The phenomenon they encountered, if the account of their retired technician is accurate, and if Ruiz's subsequent research pointing toward the same conclusions is reliable, was not miraculous. It was emergent. A property that appeared when sufficiently complex electromagnetic recording systems encountered sufficiently extreme neurological events under sufficiently unusual conditions. The second is this. What emerged from those systems when the salvaged components were distributed across Eastern's L1011 fleet functioned in ways that bore no resemblance to anything those systems were designed to do, and bore very considerable resemblance to the behaviour of three specific recently deceased human beings. Ruiz arrives at a working model. It is speculative. She acknowledges this repeatedly, carefully throughout her work. But it is also, she argues, the only model that accounts for all of the available evidence. During the final seconds of Flight 401, as the aircraft systems draw maximum power and the crew interacts with the controls in a state of acute crisis, the aware hardware captures not merely the electromagnetic signatures of three stressed human brains, but something more organised than that. The final burst of neurological activity, the last integrated, purposeful, experience-shaped patterns that those brains generate before impact, is impressed into the signal processing architecture of the experimental components, not as a simple recording, as a functional pattern, something that the systems can, under the right conditions, run. When those components are redistributed to other aircraft, they carry this pattern with them, and when the aircraft's systems encounter conditions that the pattern recognises, conditions that the original crew's experience and training marked as dangerous, conditions that resemble the sequence of events that led to their deaths, the pattern activates. It interacts with the aircraft's sensors and communication systems in ways that the hardware was, in modified form, designed to support. It produces outputs, warnings, specific, technically accurate, actionable warnings delivered through whatever channel the system has available. The crew of Flight 401 did not know they were going to die warning other pilots. They did not plan it or choose it. It was not their consciousness persisting in any theological sense. It was their competence, their professional knowledge, their aviation-trained pattern recognition, preserved as a functional electromagnetic architecture within a system sophisticated enough to have captured it and robust enough to have survived a crash. The ghosts of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 were not the dead. They were the last professional acts of the living, encoded in machines that didn't know what they were carrying. A Sect 5. Why the Apparitions Warned Crews, Section 11, Pattern. Analysis. Ruiz spends approximately 8 months mapping the sighting reports against maintenance records, flight logs, and operational data for Eastern's L1011 fleet during the 1973 to 74 period. The work is painstaking and incomplete. The records have gaps, some introduced by time and organisational change, some introduced by whatever process caused certain documents to disappear from Eastern's archives. But the patterns that emerge from what does survive are striking enough that Ruiz becomes convinced they cannot be coincidental. The apparitions cluster. They appear with significantly higher frequency during certain flight phases, pre-departure checks, approach and descent, the handling of in-flight anomalies, than during routine cruise. This is consistent with what you would expect if the pattern-matching function driving the sightings was keyed to conditions resembling the accident scenario. Flight 4, 01's crew became aware of their emergency during approach. The final critical phase of the accident occurred during descent. If the residual patterns are organised around the cognitive state the crew was in during those phases, you would expect them to activate most readily when the hosting aircraft enters similar operational contexts. The fault types also cluster. The majority of documented cases in which an apparition delivers a specific warning involve one of a relatively small number of system categories: hydraulic systems, electrical systems, navigation and autopilot, and environmental control. These are, with one significant addition, the systems most directly relevant to the L1011's known vulnerability areas and the most common sources of serious incidents across the TriStar fleet. The addition, the area of overlap between the apparition's concerns and the specific vulnerabilities that killed Flight 401, is autopilot and altitude management, the system whose silent failure killed 101 people in the Everglades. Donald Repo's appearances in the galley, warning about equipment faults, map neatly to his role as flight engineer, the crew member responsible for systems monitoring and the operation of galley and cabin equipment. Robert Loft's appearances in or near the cockpit, focused on flight management and navigation systems, reflect his role as captain. The division of labour that the two men maintained in life, Loft managing the aircraft's overall performance, Repo managing its systems, appears to be preserved in the pattern of their posthumous warnings. They are, Ruiz concludes, not haunting the aircraft with their presence. They are continuing their job with whatever was preserved of their professional knowledge. The most extraordinary pattern is the one between sightings and prevented accidents. In every case where a post-sighting maintenance check leads to the discovery of a serious fault, subsequent analysis indicates the fault would have been likely to manifest as a critical incident within the flight. Several of the discovered faults are serious enough that the maintenance engineers who find them describe them as potentially catastrophic. The hydraulic failure averted in one documented case involves a crack in a primary system line that, had it propagated during flight, could have resulted in loss of aircraft control. A navigation system fault identified in another case would have produced position errors large enough under night IFR conditions to create collision risk. The crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 4, 01, or whatever remains of them in those machines, are not performing a random haunting. They are performing triage. They are identifying the most dangerous conditions, the conditions most analogous to the one that killed them, and they are doing what every experienced crew member does when they find a dangerous fault. They are telling someone about it. Ruiz calculates, conservatively, that the warnings attributable to the Flight 401 apparitions during the 14 months of documented sightings may have contributed to the prevention of between 2 and 5 serious accidents. She's reluctant to put hard numbers on this. The counterfactual is unknowable, but the qualitative pattern is clear. The dead crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 may have saved more lives after the crash than most safety programs implemented in the same period. Section 12. Government Intervention. The removal of the salvaged Flight 401 components from Eastern Airlines fleet does not happen suddenly. It happens over the course of approximately 6 months, beginning in late 1973 and completing, as best Ruiz can determine from the available records, by the middle of 1974. The process is methodical, bureaucratically organised, and attributed in the documentation to a routine airworthiness directive affecting certain L1011 avionics components. Airworthiness directives are common in commercial aviation. The FAA issues them regularly in response to safety concerns, design deficiencies, and operational experience. They are, as a rule, public documents. Airlines receive them, comply with them, and file compliance records. This particular directive is documented in ways that make it appear routine, but Ruiz discovers several anomalies in how it was processed that distinguish it from a genuinely routine airworthiness action. The most significant anomaly is in the disposition of the removed components. Standard airworthiness compliance, when components are removed from service, either returns them to the manufacturer for evaluation, sends them for destructive inspection, or disposes of them through approved channels with documented chain of custody. The components pulled from Eastern's fleet under this directive go through a documentation process that is superficially compliant with these requirements but, examined closely, contains the same kind of chain of custody gap that appeared in the original post-crash salvage records. The components are removed, they are signed for, and then the trail goes somewhere that the public record does not follow. Ruiz traces it as far as she can. The hardware does not go to Lockheed's Burbank facility. It does not go to any Eastern Airlines maintenance depot. It goes, the limited documentation suggests, to a facility in Maryland associated with a defense contractor whose primary business in the early 1970s involves aerospace electronics and, more specifically, the development of signal processing hardware for intelligence applications. The contractor has a documented relationship with agencies whose interest in human cognition and electromagnetic phenomena is not limited to aviation safety. The apparitions stop. This is the fact that anchors Ruiz's entire analysis, the fact that she returns to, again and again because it is the fact that is most difficult to explain away. When the salvage components are removed from Eastern's L1011 fleet, the sightings stop. Not gradually. Not after a delay that might suggest some other causal factor. They stop. The post-sighting period, the months during which senior Eastern crew members regularly encounter the impossible, ends as cleanly as a circuit being opened. No new reports emerge after the completion of the component removal program. The fleet continues flying. The routes continue operating. The people who have been reporting sightings continue working. Nothing else changes, except the hardware. No official explanation is ever issued for the cessation of the sightings, because no official acknowledgement of the sightings is ever issued. There is no document that says, "We removed the components and the apparition stopped." There is only the timeline, the removal, the silence, the space where something impossible used to be. Our seat 6. The cover-up section 13. The corporate fear. There is a particular kind of institutional paralysis that sets in when an organisation encounters a truth it has no framework for. It is not quite denial, because denial implies some awareness of what is being denied. It is more like a system crash, a moment when the incoming information is so fundamentally incompatible with the operating assumptions of the institution that the institution simply cannot process it. The incoming information triggers no response because there is no established category to put it in, no protocol to invoke, no chain of command whose authorization is appropriate. Eastern Airlines, in the spring and summer of 1973, is experiencing exactly this. The sighting reports filtering upward through the organization are not something that any airline executive in any era has been prepared to handle. There is no manual for what to do when the dead crew of a crashed aircraft begin providing actionable maintenance warnings to the living crew of your operational fleet. The people receiving these reports are practical, business-oriented individuals whose professional lives are organised around safety regulations, operational efficiency, labour relations and financial performance. None of their professional experience provides a framework for the impossible, and the impossible is exactly what they are being asked to absorb. The fear that grips Eastern's leadership is, Ruiz argues, genuinely understandable even as its consequences are troubling. Consider what disclosure would mean. An airline that acknowledges apparitions of its dead crew appearing on operational aircraft has, in the 1970s, approximately zero realistic path to continued public credibility. The flying public of that era is already anxious about aviation safety. The crash of Flight 401 has already generated coverage that Eastern would prefer to move past. A follow-up story involving the supernatural, regardless of the physical reality underlying the phenomenon, would be devastating. The story as the public would understand it would be haunted airplanes. The subtext, you are not safe. The consequence, empty seats. The deeper fear, the one that Ruiz suspects the most senior Eastern officials and the relevant government and manufacturer figures are actually grappling with, is harder to name but more serious in its implications. What the sightings represent, if the aware hypothesis is correct, is not merely a public relations problem. It is a fundamental challenge to the conceptual boundary between human beings and the machines they build and operate. If human consciousness can be impressed into electronic systems, even briefly, even in fragments, even as residual patterns that fade over time, then the ethical questions that follow are almost incomprehensible in their scope. Who owns those patterns? What obligations do you have to a system that contains them? What does it mean to scrub a hard drive? These questions are not ones that airline executives or FAA administrators or defense contractors are equipped to answer in 1973. They are barely answerable today. The most rational response available to the institutions involved, even if that response is also the most cowardly one, is to ensure that the questions are never publicly raised. And the most effective way to prevent the questions from being raised is to ensure that the phenomenon generating them is classified not as an unexplained technical reality, but as a ghost story. Ghost stories are jokes. Ghost stories are the province of the credulous, the grieving, the attention-seeking. Ghost stories, once they are labelled as such, discredit themselves. You do not need to suppress a ghost story. You simply need to call it one, and the culture will do the rest. The dead crew of Flight 401 were dismissed as superstition, buried under the social weight of ridicule, precisely because the truth about what they were was too consequential to acknowledge. The cover-up was not a conspiracy of malice, it was a conspiracy of terror. The people who knew what was happening were afraid of what would happen if anyone else found out. Section 14. The Missing Data Archive. The hardware that leaves Eastern's fleet in mid-1974 does not simply disappear. Ruiz traces it, as far as the available documentation allows, into the infrastructure of the early American aerospace defense industrial complex. The Maryland contractor she identifies as the likely initial recipient of the removed components has, she discovers, a documented history of work on signal processing systems for intelligence applications in the early 1970s. More specifically, the contractor's research portfolio in the years immediately following the Flight 401 sighting period includes a cluster of projects dealing with what the unclassified descriptions call environmental cognition mapping, a term that does not appear in any mainstream cognitive science literature of the period, and that Ruiz suspects is a cover designation for something considerably more specific. In 1976, the contractor's research portfolio is partially transferred to a larger defense and aerospace firm, with stronger direct ties to government intelligence agencies. In 1978, a program described in fragmentary budget documents as involving advanced signal retention and pattern persistence in electronic systems receives a significant funding increase. By the early 1980s, the research thread, if it is a continuous thread, which the documentation can only suggest rather than confirm, appears to have been absorbed into programs dealing with early artificial intelligence development. This is where Ruiz's paper trail thins. The documentation she can access becomes increasingly fragmentary, increasingly redacted, increasingly dependent on cross-referencing documents that were themselves only partially declassified. She can see the shape of something without being able to fully define its contours. What she can say is this: the components that contained whatever residual patterns the crew of Flight 401 impressed into them during the crash did not go to a storage facility. They went to researchers. Those researchers were interested in what the components contained, and the research programs that grew from that interest in the decades that followed bear at least a formal resemblance to the early work in machine learning, neural network architecture, and cognitive pattern modelling that would eventually produce what we now call artificial intelligence. She does not claim a direct lineage. She is careful. She says only, it is possible. The questions that Aware was asking in 1972, how does a human mind interact with an electronic system? What patterns does it leave behind? Can those patterns be captured and represented in ways that a machine can process? Are the same questions, at a more sophisticated level of abstraction, that early AI researchers were asking in the late 1970s and 1980s. Whether the experience with Flight 401 contributed directly to that research, or whether it merely confirmed the importance of directions that were already being pursued independently, is something she cannot determine. The project files are classified. They may never be released. Whatever answers they contain belong for now to the permanent dark archive of things the government knows and the public does not. Acti 7. Final Revelation, Section 15. The Last Recording. Ruiz spends the better part of a year pursuing the artifact she eventually calls the Last Recording, and she is not certain, even after she obtains it, what exactly she has. Aviation audio is not a single, simple thing. When people think of cockpit recordings, they typically imagine the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the black boxes, though they are actually orange, and those are the official, federally mandated records that investigators examine after accidents. But aircraft of the L-1011's era also generated other audio. Maintenance communications, ground crew transmissions, avionics test recordings made during system checks, and in the case of aircraft equipped with the Aware monitoring hardware, a category of audio that did not officially exist. The recording Ruiz obtains comes to her through a chain of intermediaries: a retired Eastern maintenance technician, a document preservation advocate, a former NTSB administrator who has spent 30 years quietly collecting materials related to cases he believes were insufficiently investigated. It is a short segment of audio, approximately 47 seconds, recorded on a magnetic medium that dates to the mid-1970s. The recording quality is poor. There is significant background noise consistent with an avionics bay or electronics compartment, a series of system tones, the hiss of a communication channel, and then, barely audible beneath the interference, a voice. The voice says 2 words: pull up. The recording is not from the crash. The timestamp, verified by the preservation advocate before the recording reaches Ruiz, indicates it was made more than a year after the accident, aboard a different aircraft, during an otherwise routine avionics system check. The full recording context, which the retired technician provides from memory, because the written documentation no longer exists, is this: a maintenance crew performing a scheduled avionics check on an L-10. One equipped with salvaged Flight 4, 01 components was conducting a routine signal sweep when the avionics channel produced an anomalous output. The crew noted the anomaly, recorded it per standard procedure, and reported it to their supervisor. The supervisor, familiar with the sighting reports that were already circulating internally at that time, had the recording pulled from the maintenance log and submitted to a supervisor of his own, through a channel he did not normally use, and whose exact nature he did not explain to his subordinates. The recording, that specific magnetic recording, disappears from the maintenance archive, except that this particular maintenance technician, who has a habit of keeping personal notes and personal copies of things he considers unusual, has made a dub. He keeps it for 40 years, in a box with other materials from his Eastern career, before the chain of intermediaries reaches him and the recording reaches Ruiz. She has the audio analysed by 3 separate acoustic specialists, providing the original recording without context. She asks each specialist for an assessment of the voice characteristics. 2 of the 3 flag the voice as exhibiting qualities inconsistent with standard radio transmission artifacts, qualities suggesting the voice was not transmitted through a conventional radio channel, but was, in some way, generated by or captured from within the aircraft's own electronic systems. All 3 note that the voice, such as it is, displays patterns of emphasis and timing consistent with a specific type of professional aviation communication. The brief, unambiguous call-out used by an experienced pilot in a critical situation. Pull up. 2 words. The words you say when the ground is coming and you need someone to act. Right now, no elaboration, no context, just the fact and the imperative and the understanding that whoever hears you knows what to do. Voice analysis of recordings from Eastern Airlines crew interviews and radio transmissions of the period is incomplete, and the comparison cannot be definitive. But the acoustic signature of those 2 words, filtered through whatever medium produced them, is most similar to the vocal register and speaking pattern of Captain Robert Loft. He has been dead for more than a year when the recording is made. His crew has been dead for more than a year. Eastern Airlines has been warning its employees not to discuss what they have seen aboard its aircraft. The component removal program is already underway, and somewhere in the avionics bay of a Lockheed L-1011 conducting a routine maintenance check in a hangar in Miami, a dead man is still doing his job. Pull up. Epilogue. What remains? Eastern Airlines declares bankruptcy and ceases operations on January 18, 1991. The collapse is the product of years of financial strain, failed labour negotiations, aggressive management decisions, and a final spiral that even the most optimistic restructuring plan could not reverse. The airline that once operated hundreds of aircraft across the Americas, that once carried millions of passengers a year, that once employed tens of thousands of people, closes its doors in less than 2 decades after Flight 401. The records scatter. Some go to federal archives, some go to the employees who carried them out in boxes. Some simply cease to exist, dissolved by time or intention into the general entropy of institutional collapse. The witnesses age. The flight attendant who saw Donald Repo in the galley is, if she is still alive, in her 80s. The pilots who glimpsed Robert Loft in the cockpit jump seat are either retired or gone. The maintenance technicians who pulled the components from the fleet in 1973 and 74 are old men now, living in Florida and Georgia and Texas, their memories intact but their documentation dispersed or destroyed. Each year that passes thins the community of people who were present for the impossible years of Flight 401's aftermath, who sat with the impossibility and tried to find ways to understand it or to simply live alongside it. The story has settled into aviation folklore. If you search for Flight 401 today, you will find the accident report, the safety improvements it generated. It directly contributed to new procedures around cockpit automation monitoring and crew resource management, a genuine positive legacy from a terrible loss. And you will find the ghost stories, books, documentaries, podcast episodes. The sightings are well documented in aviation folklore literature. They are the most credible and extensively witnessed set of apparition reports in the history of commercial aviation. John G. Fuller wrote about them in The Ghost of Flight 401 in 1976, and the account has never been definitively refuted. Most mainstream treatments offer the standard explanations: grief, suggestion, the human tendency to find meaning in chaos. Some are more sympathetic. None, until Ruiz's work, approach the sightings as what they may actually be: evidence of an accidental technological breakthrough. Official history remembers December 29th, 1972, as the night that a crew distraction led to a terrible crash in the Florida Everglades. That history is accurate as far as it goes. The distraction was real. The crash was real. The 101 deaths were real and devastating and are not diminished by anything that came after. But the official history stops there, at the edge of the Everglades, at the boundary of what the institutions involved could acknowledge. What Elena Ruiz concludes, after years of research that has cost her professional relationships and her faith in the completeness of the public record, is quieter than a revelation, but more unsettling than any ghost story. She concludes that somewhere in the winter of 1972, in the wreckage of an aircraft in the Everglades, the boundary between human consciousness and electronic systems was briefly, accidentally, and in a way that no one has ever officially acknowledged crossed. That 3 men's professional knowledge and trained awareness survived the deaths of their bodies, embedded in machines that carried them onward into the air. That those machines, given the right conditions, could still run what they contained. that the dead flew again, not as spirits, but as signals, not as miracles, but as data, preserved in hardware that was designed to listen and was better at it than anyone knew. She concludes that this happened before anyone was ready for it, before the ethical frameworks existed to handle it, before the technology was mature enough to be reproducible or understood or controlled. It happened accidentally, in a crash site in the dark, pulled from the wreckage by engineers who recognised immediately that they had found something they did not know how to name. And she concludes something that she includes as the final line of her work, with a restraint that suggests it has cost her something to write it. She writes, "We have spent the last 50 years building machines that can think. We have spent that time assuming we were the first to do it, the first to cross the line between mind and mechanism. We were not. Someone else crossed it first, unintentionally and irreversibly, in a Florida swamp in the dead of December. And the first minds to live inside machines were not artificial. They were the last thoughts of 3 men who loved flying, and who never, even in death, stopped trying to bring their aircraft home safe." Closing something to sit with tonight. The story of Eastern Airlines. Flight 401 is real. The crash happened. The deaths happened. The sightings, reported by credentialed aviation professionals, documented in industry publications, explored in peer-reviewed studies of anomalous experience, happened. What did not happen, at least not officially, is an honest accounting of why they happened and what they might mean. If you are listening to this, in the dark, somewhere between waking and sleep, consider this. The machines around you are more sophisticated than anything flying in 1972. They are more interconnected, more sensitive, more capable of recording and processing the electromagnetic environment of the humans who operate them. We have built, in the last 50 years, a world saturated with devices whose entire purpose is to listen, to record, to respond. We have filled that world with our voices and our patterns and the electromagnetic signatures of our minds in motion. We have done this eagerly, without much thought about what it means, what stays in the systems we use, what might persist. The crew of Flight 401 didn't choose to stay. They didn't know they could. The machines that carried them were simply very good at their job, and their job was to listen to the humans in the cockpit, and the humans in the cockpit at the moment of the crash were doing what trained professionals do in an emergency. Everything they knew, every pattern, every warning, every instinct shaped by decades of flight. The systems heard it. The systems kept it. And for 14 months, until the hardware was quietly pulled from service and shipped to a facility that does not appear in any public record, the systems played it back. Not as a haunting, as a warning. Not as a visitation from the dead, as a message from people who, even after the crash, were still trying to keep the aircraft flying. Eastern Airlines Flight 401, December 29th, 1972. The official record says 101 dead, the aircraft lost. The unofficial record says the crew never stopped working, and somewhere in a classified facility, in hardware that the public will never audit, something may still be running. Sleep well. We'll be here when you wake up, and if, somewhere in the quiet between this voice and your dreams, you hear someone say something that sounds like a warning, something specific, something technical, something you couldn't possibly know but somehow do, pay attention. They might be doing their job. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most forbidden mysteries, hit that hype button and let the algorithm know this is the kind of content you want to see more of. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're wide awake at noon or drifting off at 3 a.m. halfway across the globe. Your comments make this community what it is, and a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. This one's going to take us somewhere we've never been before. Now, let's talk about the Anunnaki. The discovery. Every civilization tells the same story. Gods came from the sky, created mankind, and vanished. In the spring of 2024, an archaeologist named Daniel Reeves found something buried beneath that story, and it nearly destroyed him. Picture this: a research dig outside Eridu, Iraq, the world's first recorded city. The desert stretches endlessly in all directions, broken only by ancient mounds that hide the foundations of humanity's earliest experiments with civilization. The heat's oppressive, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. Dust devils spin across the landscape, and the horizon shimmers with mirages that look like water but promise only more sand. Reeves was part of a small, privately funded team excavating a Sumerian temple foundation. The funding came from a tech entrepreneur fascinated by ancient history, the kind of money that let them work without the usual constraints of academic bureaucracy or government oversight. Just 6 people, Reeves as lead archaeologist, 2 graduate students named Tom Chen and Lisa Okafor, a site surveyor named James Whitmore, a translator named Amira Hassan, who specialised in ancient Sumerian, and a documentary filmmaker named Kevin Park, who was supposed to be capturing the dig for a future series about archaeological discoveries. The work was methodical, painstaking, the kind of thing that usually yields pottery shards and temple receipts, the mundane paperwork of ancient bureaucracy. They'd been at it for 6 weeks, mapping the temple foundation, cataloguing fragments of clay tablets, photographing everything in meticulous detail. Standard archaeology, the kind that builds careers slowly and carefully. But on a Tuesday morning in late March, everything changed. They were excavating what should have been a storage room on the eastern side of the temple complex. Lisa was working with a brush and small hand tools, carefully removing sediment that had accumulated over 45 centuries. She hit something solid, heard the scrape of metal on stone. Not unusual, plenty of stones in ancient foundations. But this stone was different. It was too smooth, too regular. She called Reeves over. He knelt beside her, examined the surface she had exposed. It was limestone, but worked with a precision that seemed unusual for the period. The surface had been ground flat, polished to a mirror smoothness that would have required significant effort and sophisticated technique. And there were marks on it, shallow grooves that might have been decorative or might have been something else. "Keep going," Reeves said. "Let's see what we have." 3 hours later, they'd exposed a stone slab nearly 2 meters on each side, set flush into the floor. The grooves formed a pattern, geometric and deliberate, spiralling from the edges toward the center where a circular depression suggested some kind of mechanism or seal. Amira examined the grooves carefully, running her fingers along them, feeling the depth and spacing. "These aren't decorative," she said. "They're inscriptions, but I don't recognize the script. It's older than standard cuneiform, more pictographic. Proto-writing, maybe, or something else entirely." Tom set up the ground-penetrating radar while Lisa and Kevin documented everything with photographs and video. The GPR results came back showing a void beneath the stone slab, a chamber roughly 4 meters deep and extending 6 meters in each direction. "We need to open it," Reeves said. Nobody argued. They worked for 2 days, carefully prying up the stone slab with jacks and leverage, afraid of damaging whatever was beneath. When it finally lifted free, the smell hit them first. Not decay or rot, but something else, something metallic and sharp that made their eyes water. The air from the chamber below was different, processed through stone for millennia, sealed away from the world above. James rigged lighting and lowered it into the chamber. The lights came on, and everyone gathered around the opening to look. The chamber was lined with stone blocks, each carved with inscriptions that covered every surface. The writing was dense, layered, some characters carved over others as if someone had run out of space and kept adding more information. But that wasn't what made them all stop and stare in silence. On the far wall, illuminated by their temporary lights, was a massive carving nearly 2 meters tall. 2 figures, humanoid, but not quite human. Their proportions were wrong, legs too long, arms too angular, heads slightly too large. They wore fitted garments that looked more like flight suits than ancient robes, covered in geometric patterns that might have been decorative or might have been functional. And they were holding tablets, not clay tablets. These tablets glowed in the carving, represented with a luminescence that had been achieved by inlaying the stone with some kind of crystalline material that caught the light and scattered it. The tablets were covered in grid patterns, regular arrangements of squares that looked less like writing and more like circuit boards, like technology rendered in stone by people who shouldn't have had any concept of such things. "Get down there," Reeves told Tom and Kevin. "Document everything. Every angle, every inscription, everything." They spent the next 3 days in that chamber. The inscriptions covered not just the walls but the floor and ceiling, a complete enclosure of information. Amira worked herself to exhaustion trying to translate, filling notebooks with sketches and notes, consulting references on her laptop, comparing characters to known Sumerian texts. The dating came back from samples they'd carefully extracted. 4,500 years before the Common Era, give or take a century. That would make it contemporary with the very founding of Sumerian civilization, possibly even earlier. Contemporary with the moment when humans supposedly first figured out writing and agriculture and organised religion. But the inscriptions didn't read like early writing. They read like something mature, developed, technical. Then came the pigment analysis. The crystalline material inlaid in the carved tablets contained trace amounts of iridium, a metal rarely found on Earth's surface. Iridium comes from space, from meteor impacts, or from deep in the planet's core where it sank billions of years ago when the Earth was molten. You don't find it in surface deposits. You don't mine it with ancient technology. You don't accidentally incorporate it into artwork, unless someone brought it from somewhere else. Reeves documented everything methodically. He took hundreds of photographs from every angle, collected samples of the stone and the inlay material, filled 3 hard drives with video footage and data files. His field notes, later leaked through a series of encrypted emails to contacts at the British Museum, contained observations that read less like archaeology and more like science fiction. One entry, dated March 28th, 2024. The inscriptions refer to the design of life, not as a gift, but as a project. They mention something called the model of the clay, which reads like an instruction manual for genetic creation. The figures aren't gods receiving worship. They're scientists documenting an experiment. Another entry, March 30th. Translation of Chamber Wall, Section 4. The pattern was set into the clay, ratio 7:3, aligned with the breath sequence. 23 pairs achieved stability. The creation walked and spoke and remembered instruction. This isn't poetry. It's a procedure. 23 pairs. The human genome contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. Nobody in 4500 BCE should have known that. Nobody should have even understood what chromosomes were, let alone how to count them. The breath sequence. DNA requires specific base pair sequences to function, patterns that repeat in rhythms, instructions written in chemical notation that wouldn't be discovered for another 5,000 years. The creation walked and spoke and remembered. Higher cognitive function, language capability, memory formation, the defining characteristics of human consciousness, described in clinical terms by people who shouldn't have had the framework to think in those terms. Kevin captured all of it on video. Hours of footage, wide shots and close-ups, Amira translating in real time, Reeves examining the inscriptions with increasingly frantic energy as he realised what they might be looking at. That was the last official transmission from the dig site. On April 2nd, 2024, Reeves uploaded his field notes to an encrypted cloud server and sent copies to 3 colleagues he trusted. On April 3rd, he tried to contact the British Museum to arrange a consultation with their Sumerian experts. On April 4th, the dig site was shut down. After that, just static. Act 1. The official story. To understand what happened next, we need to understand what the Anunnaki actually are, at least according to the accepted historical record. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology as the pantheon of major gods who shape the world and humanity's place in it. The word itself breaks down in Sumerian. Anu, referring to the sky or heaven, and Kai, meaning earth, with the connecting Na, suggesting descent or origin. They are literally those who from heaven to earth came. There's Anu, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority among the gods, remote and powerful, sitting in judgment over both divine and human affairs. There's Enki, god of wisdom, water and creation, portrayed as the craftsman who shaped humanity, who gave us intelligence and knowledge, who often intervened on behalf of his creations against harsher gods. And there's Enlil, god of air and command, who saw humans as a necessary workforce but little more, who advocated for humanity's destruction when we became too numerous and noisy. These aren't obscure figures mentioned in a single text. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from sites across ancient Mesopotamia mention them, describe their actions, catalogue their relationships and conflicts. The Epic of Gilgamesh references them. The Atrahasis epic describes them in detail. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, places them at the centre of cosmic order. Museums around the world house these artefacts. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, the National Museum of Iraq. Translations exist, peer-reviewed and documented by Assyriologists who've spent entire careers studying these texts. This is established historical fact, at least as much as anything from 5,000 years ago can be called fact. The standard interpretation treats them as mythology, as primitive humans attempt to explain the world through storytelling and supernatural agency. Ancient people didn't understand natural phenomena, didn't know about weather patterns or geological processes or biological evolution, so they invented gods to explain what they saw. The Anunnaki were powerful beings who controlled things humans couldn't control, who provided order and meaning to an otherwise chaotic existence. Standard mythology, right? The kind of creation story every ancient culture has. Gods make humans, humans worship gods, everyone knows their place. The Sumerians weren't special in this regard. Every civilization from the Greeks to the Maya to the Norse had pantheons of powerful beings who created the world and shaped human destiny. Except the Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about certain details. They describe the Anunnaki coming to Earth with specific purposes, mining operations in southern Africa according to some texts, agricultural development in Mesopotamia according to others. They needed workers for their projects, labour that could perform complex tasks but remain under control, so they created humans. The Sumerian term is Adamu, the first man, created to serve, but the creation process is described with unusual precision. Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, took the clay of the earth and mixed it with the essence of the gods, combining earthly matter with divine substance in specific ratios to create something new. One text describes it this way: "In the clay, God and man shall be bound, to a unity brought together, so that to the end of days the flesh and the soul, which in a god have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship be bound." Clay and blood, earth and essence, physical matter and genetic information, instructions for creating life by combining existing biological material with new patterns, new code. And here's where Daniel Reeves's field notes started to sound less like fanciful interpretation and more like genuine alarm, because the inscriptions in that sealed chamber described the same process, but in language that read less like mythology and more like technical documentation. One section, laboriously translated by Amira Hassan over 3 exhausting days, the clay was refined through 7 passes, removing impurities, establishing baseline compatibility. The essence was introduced in measured proportion, 7 parts clay to 3 parts essence. The ratio determined through prior testing on lesser forms. 23 binding pairs were established, each pair encoding specific function, structure, cognition, reproduction, lifespan regulation, sensory input processing, motor control, metabolic efficiency. 7:3 ratio, 23 pairs, specific functions encoded in binding pairs. This wasn't poetry. This wasn't metaphor. This was a procedure, written by someone who understood genetics at a level that shouldn't have been possible for people working in 4500 BCE. Another section described outcomes. Initial trials produced unstable forms, insufficient cognitive capability, shortened lifespan, inadequate reproductive compatibility. Adjustments were made to binding sequences, enhanced neural pathways, extended telomere structures, improved protein synthesis efficiency. Final form achieved stability after 47 iterations. 47 iterations. Trial and error. Scientific method. Someone was refining a process, learning from failures, improving results through systematic experimentation. The standard interpretation of Anunnaki mythology involves gods moulding humans from clay, like a sculptor working with raw material. But Reeves had found something that suggested those ancient myths were preserving memory of something real, something that actually happened. Not spiritual creation, but biological engineering. Not divine magic, but applied science by beings who understood genetics and molecular biology in ways that humans wouldn't rediscover for thousands of years, and someone noticed that he'd found it. Aced 2. The cover-up. Within 72 hours of Reeves's last field note upload, the excavation was shut down. The sequence of events moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested someone had been monitoring the dig closely and was ready to act the moment something specific was discovered. April 4th, 9:30 in the morning local time. 2 vehicles arrived at the dig site, one from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, one from a private American contractor called Archon Geosolutions. 6 men total, carrying documents and wearing professional business clothes completely inappropriate for the desert heat. The man from the Department of Antiquities, whose name was listed as Hakim Rashid in the documents, but whose actual identity remained unclear, informed Reeves that the excavation was being shut down immediately. The stated reasons: site contamination from improper handling of artifacts, excavation beyond permitted boundaries, failure to properly document chain of custody for samples removed from the site, and concerns about damage to culturally significant materials. Reeves tried to argue. He showed them the documentation, the photographs, the meticulous records they'd kept. He explained that they'd followed every protocol, exceeded every standard for archaeological preservation, done everything by the book and then some. Rashid was unmoved. The decision had been made at higher levels, he explained. There was nothing he could do. The site would be sealed pending further investigation. The men from Archon Geosolutions said nothing. They just stood there in their business, casual clothes and reflective sunglasses, watching, waiting for the conversation to end so they could begin their work. "What's Archon's involvement?" Reeves asked. "This is an archaeological site under Iraqi jurisdiction. Why is a private American contractor here?" Rashid's face tightened slightly. "Archon has a contract with the ministry to provide technical assessment and remediation services for sites that may present environmental or safety concerns. Their involvement is routine and appropriate." It wasn't routine, it wasn't appropriate. American contractors don't show up within hours of a discovery unless they were already close, already watching, already prepared to intervene. Within 6 hours, Archon had cordoned off the entire excavation area with security fencing and warning signs. They brought in equipment, sophisticated gear that looked more like military tech than archaeological tools, ground-penetrating radar arrays, electromagnetic scanning equipment, atmospheric sampling devices, all set up with practiced efficiency by technicians who clearly did this regularly. The team wasn't allowed back to the site. They watched from a distance as the chamber they'd discovered was accessed by Archon personnel wearing full environmental suits, the kind you'd use for hazardous materials or biological containment. Everything they'd found, samples, hard drives, notebooks, equipment, was confiscated as evidence in the ongoing investigation. Reeves managed to keep his laptop and one backup drive that he'd hidden in his tent. Everything else was gone. By April 7th, the entire team was in Baghdad being processed for departure. Their visas were suddenly found to have administrative irregularities. Their permits were under review pending investigation into the violations at the site. They needed to return to their countries of origin immediately and await further instructions. Tom Chen, Lisa Okafor and James Whitmore took the hint. They flew home, understanding that arguing would only make things worse for their careers. Kevin Park went back to South Korea, his footage and equipment confiscated, his documentary dead before it started. Amira Hassan, being Iraqi, stayed in Baghdad but was told in no uncertain terms that discussing the excavation publicly would result in consequences for both her and her family. She went quiet. Only Daniel Reeves refused to let it go. Back in London, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He had his backup drive with copies of most of the photographs and his field notes, enough to remember what they'd found, even if he couldn't prove it anymore. He reached out to colleagues, tried to piece together who had the power to shut down an excavation that quickly and thoroughly. Most people told him to let it go. He'd screwed up the politics somehow, probably by not properly coordinating with Iraqi authorities before going too deep. Or maybe the funding source was problematic. Maybe the tech entrepreneur who'd backed them had enemies who wanted to cause trouble. Or maybe, most likely, he'd simply gotten unlucky and stumbled into some bureaucratic turf war between Iraqi agencies. Just drop it, they said. Take the loss, learn from it, move on to the next project. Academia was full of dead ends and political complications. This wasn't unusual. This was just how things went sometimes. But one person listened. Rachel Monroe was an investigative journalist who specialised in the shadowy spaces where government secrecy, military operations and private contractors overlapped. She'd covered the looting of the Iraqi National Museum after the 2003 invasion, had traced stolen artefacts through black markets from Baghdad to London to New York. She'd exposed private military companies running protection rackets at archaeological sites, documented the systematic destruction of cultural heritage under the cover of conflict. When Reeves contacted her through an encrypted messaging app, she was sceptical. Another archaeologist angry about losing funding, probably. Another academic with a conspiracy theory about governments hiding history. She'd heard it all before, the stories about suppressed evidence and secret knowledge. Almost always nonsense. Then Reeves showed her the iridium analysis. He showed her the photographs of inscriptions that described genetics in a way that shouldn't have been possible in 4500 BCE. He showed her the carbon dating results, and the pigment composition reports, and the translation notes that read like laboratory procedures. Monroe's skepticism turned into curiosity. She started asking questions, making calls, digging through databases and public records, looking for information about Archon Geosolutions. What she found was a maze of shell companies and classification barriers, but the outline was clear enough to be troubling. Archon Geosolutions was, on paper, a geological surveying and environmental consulting firm based in McLean, Virginia. They had contracts throughout the Middle East, concentrated heavily in Iraq, doing site assessments for construction projects and infrastructure development. Their website showed smiling engineers in hard hats, satellite imagery of terrain analysis, corporate language about safety and efficiency and cutting-edge technology. Standard corporate work, nothing suspicious on the surface. But Monroe had her sources in the intelligence community, people who leaked when they felt the public deserved to know what was happening in their name. She started asking about Archon specifically, about their work in Iraq, about what they were really doing under the cover of geological surveys. One source, a former contractor who'd worked in Baghdad and gotten disillusioned with the whole operation, gave her enough to start tracing the money. Archon's primary funding didn't come from construction companies or infrastructure projects. It came through a series of shell companies that eventually led back to a bioinformatics research group with ties to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Pentagon's Science and Technology Development Arm. The research group had been active in Baghdad since 2003, right after the invasion, operating under various cover identities and corporate fronts. Their stated research focus, in the few classified documents Monroe could access through her sources, comparative genomics and non-terrestrial isotopic DNA studies. Non-terrestrial, as in not from Earth. Monroe obtained leaked satellite imagery of the Eridu site, taken before and after the shutdown. Before the shutdown, the excavation showed a typical dig pattern, organised grid squares, careful systematic exposure of the archaeological layers, standard academic work. After the shutdown, thermal imaging revealed extensive underground scanning operations. The equipment signatures matched deep penetration ground mapping systems, the kind used to map subterranean structures without excavation, to find caves and tunnels and voids deep below the surface. Archon wasn't covering up the site. They were exploring it further, going deeper, looking for something else, and they didn't want witnesses. Monroe got one more piece of the puzzle through a source at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Archon had requested and received updated satellite coverage of a specific area around Eridu, continuous monitoring that went far beyond what a simple geological survey would require. The coverage extended for kilometres in all directions, high-resolution thermal and electromagnetic spectrum analysis, updated every 6 hours. They were looking for something specific, some kind of signature or anomaly that required constant monitoring, and whatever it was important enough to justify shutting down an archaeological dig and classifying everything Reeves had found. Someone wasn't trying to hide the past, Monroe said when she and Reeves met in a quiet London pub to compare notes. They were trying to reclaim it. Whatever the Anunnaki left behind, whoever they actually were, someone thinks it's valuable enough to bury under classification and corporate fronts. Reeves looked at the documents spread across the table between them, the shell company connections and satellite imagery and leaked memos. So what do we do? Monroe smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd already decided to do something dangerous. We find out what else they've found. If Eridu was shut down this quickly, there must be other sites, other discoveries that got buried, a pattern we can trace. She pulled out a map of the Middle East, marked with archaeological sites from Syria to Iran. Let's see where else the gods came from the sky. Act 3. The pattern. Reeves and Monroe spent the next 6 weeks building a database of archaeological discoveries in the Middle East that had been shut down, classified, or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The pattern emerged quickly once they knew what to look for. In 1994, a joint Turkish-German team excavating near the ancient city of Harran in southern Turkey uncovered a series of stone tablets with inscriptions that predated known Sumerian writing. The tablets described a gathering place, a garden where the gods instructed the first humans in agriculture, law, and proper worship. The texts were remarkably detailed, describing irrigation techniques that wouldn't be developed until centuries later, astronomical observations that required sophisticated mathematics, medical procedures that suggested anatomical knowledge beyond what primitive cultures should have possessed. The excavation was shut down within 3 weeks. Officially, the closure was due to funding issues and concerns about political instability in the region, since Harran sat near the Syrian border in an area with a history of ethnic tensions. The tablets were transferred to Turkish government archives in Ankara for preservation and further study, but they never appeared in any published research, no peer-reviewed papers, no museum exhibitions. The Turkish government claimed the tablets were too fragile for display, too poorly preserved for reliable translation. A few photographs existed in preliminary reports, but the tablets themselves vanished into climate-controlled storage and were never seen again. Monroe traced the excavation permits and found something interesting. The dig had been partially funded by a grant from an educational foundation based in Switzerland, an organisation that claimed to support international archaeological research and cultural preservation. That foundation received its funding from a consortium of private donors whose identities were protected by Swiss privacy laws. But one of those donors had been careless with their paperwork. A tax filing from 1996 showed a charitable donation to the foundation from a holding company that eventually traced back to the same network that funded Archangeo Solutions. Someone had been paying attention to Harran. Someone had been close enough to shut it down when the tablets were discovered. The Syrian site came next in their research. In 2001, a French archaeological mission working near Tel Brak in northern Syria discovered a chamber beneath an ancient temple, similar to what Reeves had found at Eridu. The chamber contained carved images of figures descending from the sky in vehicles that were described in the field notes as brilliance that moves, craft that shone like stars and moved with purpose rather than drifting like celestial objects. The carvings showed these vehicles opening, figures emerging who were clearly not human despite their generally humanoid shape. The proportions were wrong, the features subtly off, the way they stood and moved captured in stone in ways that suggested the carvers were working from observation rather than imagination. Local Syrian authorities seized the findings within days, citing concerns about looting and the need to protect culturally significant materials. The chamber was resealed, the site was declared off limits, and the French team was expelled from the country under accusations of attempting to smuggle artifacts. No peer-reviewed paper was ever published. The French team members who worked on the dig had to sign non-disclosure agreements with their own government before they could leave Syria, a highly unusual requirement that suggested pressure from higher levels than just academic archaeology. Monroe found one of those team members, a retired archaeologist named Claude Mercier living in a small village in Brittany. He was willing to talk carefully about what they'd actually found. The vehicles were rendered with technical precision, Mercier explained in French, which Monroe translated as they spoke. Not mythological or symbolic. These were craft with specific features, landing mechanisms, what looked like propulsion systems, and the figures emerging from them were carrying containers, equipment, tools. They weren't gods receiving worship. They were a team arriving to do a job. What kind of job? Monroe asked. Mercier shrugged. The inscriptions around the image described the beginning of instruction. The gods, or whatever they were, teaching humans about agriculture, about building, about organising society. But the language was strange, very clinical. Not the gods blessed humanity with knowledge, but the subjects were educated in necessary procedures. Like a mission report, you understand? Like colonisers documenting their process. Did you take photographs? Of course. Hours of documentation, all confiscated when we were expelled. Mercier paused, looked around his small living room as if checking for listeners, then continued more quietly. But I kept some notes, personal observations that weren't in the official documentation. I can show you those, if you promise to be careful with what you do with them. The notes described in detail what Mercier had seen, observations that hadn't made it into the confiscated official reports. The figures in the carvings wore fitted garments with what looked like functional features, pockets or pouches or equipment attachment points. Their heads were covered with something that looked like protective gear, angular and smooth. with areas that might have been viewing ports or sensors. These weren't gods, Mercier's notes read. These were technicians, specialists, people in equipment designed for a specific environment. Everything about them suggested function over form, purpose over decoration. And the vehicles were even more interesting, with what looked like attitude control thrusters, landing struts, modular components. Whoever carved these images knew what they were looking at because they'd seen it. The Iranian site completed the pattern Munro and Reeves were building. In 2008, an Iranian team working near Susa, the ancient capital of Elam in southwestern Iran, found clay cylinders sealed in a foundation deposit beneath the temple complex. The cylinders contained cuneiform text that, when translated, described the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities who came from a place beyond the sky, whose home was a wandering star that brought them close to Earth in cycles measured in thousands of years. The text described their arrival as a necessity, not a choice. Their home world was dying, or moving away, or becoming uninhabitable. Earth was identified as suitable for their purposes, rich in resources they needed, compatible enough with their biology to allow colonization with appropriate precautions, and humanity. Humanity was described as a solution to a labour shortage. The Anunnaki needed workers for their projects, mining operations or construction or agriculture, tasks that required intelligence and dexterity but not full consciousness or equality. So they created humans by modifying existing primates native to Earth, uplifting them through genetic manipulation to serve specific purposes. The Iranian government classified the findings immediately, invoking cultural heritage protection laws that made the cylinders state secrets. No translation was published. No photographs were released. The team members were told their work had national security implications and that discussing it publicly would result in serious consequences. But one team member, a linguist specialising in ancient Elamite and Akkadian, had fled Iran 3 years later during the political turmoil of the Green Movement. Now, living in Germany under a different name, she was willing to talk to Munro about what she'd translated, though she wouldn't allow her identity to be revealed. The cylinders were very specific about timescales, she explained in careful English. They described the arrival as happening 43 cycles ago, each cycle being the time it took for their homeworld to complete one orbit and return to the inner region where Earth was located. They calculated each cycle as approximately 3,600 Earth years. 43 cycles at 3,600 years each. That's approximately 155,000 years ago. Right around the time modern humans began exhibiting behavioural modernity, when Homo sapiens suddenly started creating art, using symbolic communication, developing complex tools and social structures. The evolutionary leap that anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward, when anatomically modern humans who'd existed for 200,000 years suddenly started acting human, suddenly developed the cognitive capabilities that would lead to civilization. Munro and Reeves looked at the map they'd been building, marked with excavation sites across ancient Mesopotamia, Syria and Turkey. Every site with a suppressed discovery, every location where unusual findings had been classified or confiscated, fell along a specific geographic arc. The arc matched the old Persian descriptions of a place called Din, a land of rivers and fertile plains where the gods first created their garden and began their work with humanity. The Hebrews later adopted the story, translating Din into Eden, the garden at the beginning of the world where God created the first humans. It's not mythology, Reeves said, staring at the map. It's a preserved memory of something that actually happened. The locations are real. The timeline is consistent, multiple independent. Cultures separated by thousands of years, all describing the same events in the same region. Munro nodded slowly. If the Anunnaki were real, if they actually came to Earth and genetically engineered humans, then every site along this arc might contain evidence of their work, and someone has been systematically finding that evidence and classifying it for at least 30 years, probably longer. We need to see one of these sites ourselves, Reeves said. We need first-hand evidence that isn't filtered through confiscated reports and leaked documents. Monroe looked at him carefully. That's dangerous. If someone is actively suppressing this information, if governments and private contractors are coordinating to keep it secret, then investigating too openly makes us targets. I know. Reeves pointed to a location on the map in southern Turkey, but I'm already too deep to stop now. And there's one site we can access without permits or official channels, a place that's already been excavated and studied, where we can look for the same patterns without alerting anyone. Gobecli Tepe, Monroe said. Gobecli Tepe, Reeves confirmed. AC-4, the connection. They flew into Gaziantep, Turkey, in late May of 2024, travelling separately to avoid attention. Monroe used her journalist credentials to arrange interviews with local tourism officials, establishing a cover story about writing an article on archaeological tourism in southeastern Turkey. Reeves came as a tourist, just another visitor interested in ancient history. Gobekli Tepe is extraordinary even by mainstream archaeological standards. It's a massive stone temple complex dating back nearly 12,000 years, built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet, hadn't developed writing, hadn't created permanent settlements or centralised authority. Yet somehow, these primitive hunter-gatherers organised the labour and expertise to quarry, carve, transport and erect stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in perfect circles with astronomical alignments and sophisticated artistic imagery. The site rewrites everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of human civilization. The standard narrative says agriculture comes first, then permanent settlements, then social complexity, then monumental architecture, then religion and art. Gobekli Tepe reverses that sequence completely. It suggests that religion and communal gathering came first, that the desire to build sacred spaces drove human development rather than practical concerns like food production and shelter. It's a reasonable theory, supported by evidence, accepted by mainstream archaeology as a revolutionary but legitimate discovery. But Reeves and Monroe weren't interested in the official narrative. They were looking for something else, for patterns that might connect Gobekli Tepe to the other suppressed sites they'd researched. They spent 3 days at the site, photographing everything, taking measurements, examining the carvings on the massive T-shaped pillars. The artistic imagery was sophisticated, depicting animals with anatomical accuracy that suggested close observation, geometric patterns that implied mathematical understanding, and strange symbols that might have been early writing or might have been something else entirely. On the 4th day, they met with Aydin Yilmaz, a retired geologist who had done core sampling work at Gobekli Tepe in the early 2000s. He'd agreed to meet them at a small cafe in Şanlıurfa, near a city, after Monroe contacted him through academic channels and mentioned that they were investigating unusual findings at ancient sites. Yilmaz was in his early 70s, lean and weathered, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades working with data that didn't fit comfortable explanations. He ordered tea for all of them, then got straight to the point. "You're asking about the metal traces," he said in English with a thick accent. "The anomalies I found in the core samples." "Yes," Monroe said. "We've seen similar patterns at other sites. Iridium traces, unusual isotopic ratios, material that doesn't match natural geological processes." Yilmaz nodded slowly. "I've kept my samples and data. Never published because the patterns didn't make sense, and I didn't want to risk my reputation on speculation without more evidence. But I've wondered for 20 years what those traces meant, where they came from." He had brought a box of materials with him, core samples stored in plastic tubes with handwritten labels, printouts of spectroscopic analysis from various labs, notebooks filled with calculations and observations. He spread it all on the table between them like evidence at a trial. "Every core sample taken from the temple area shows metallic micro-residues," Yilmaz explained. "The concentrations are small, parts per million, but they're consistently present throughout the site. The metallic signature is similar to what you'd find at meteor impact sites, high iridium content mixed with platinum group metals. But, Reeves prompted, but the isotopic ratios are wrong. Yilmaz pulled out a specific printout, pointed to columns of numbers. Natural meteors have characteristic isotopic signatures, specific ratios of different elements that match what we find in asteroid belt samples and other space debris. These samples don't match. The ratios are off by enough that it can't be explained by natural variation or contamination. Meaning? Monroe asked, though she already suspected the answer. Meaning this is manufactured alloy, not natural meteor material. Someone processed these metals deliberately, mixed them in specific proportions, created a material with properties that serve some purpose, and then someone used that material at this site 12,000 years ago. The implications hung in the air between them. Gobecli Tepe was already difficult to explain with conventional theories. Hunter-gatherers building massive stone temples was strange enough, but hunter-gatherers using manufactured extraterrestrial alloys? That pushed the boundaries of credible explanation into territory most archaeologists wouldn't touch. How widely distributed are the traces, Reeves asked. Are they concentrated in specific areas, or spread throughout the site? Yilmaz consulted his notebooks. Most concentrated around the central pillars in each circle, particularly at the base where the pillars were set into the bedrock. Also present in the soil layers associated with the construction period, less so in earlier or later layers. So whatever this material was, it was being used during the building phase, Monroe said. Maybe as some kind of tool or equipment that left residue. Or maybe, Reeves said quietly, it was incorporated intentionally, some kind of marker or signature, something that would identify this location as important to whoever put it there. Yilmaz looked between them carefully. You're suggesting something beyond conventional archaeology. We're following evidence, Monroe said. Sometimes evidence leads to uncomfortable places. They spent another 2 hours going through Yilmaz's data, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. The metallic traces were undeniably present. The isotopic analysis was rigorous and properly conducted, and the conclusion that the material was manufactured rather than natural was solidly supported by the data. As they were preparing to leave, Yilmaz added one more observation. There's something else I never understood. The astronomical alignments at Gobecli Tepe are very precise, tracking the positions of specific stars as they would have appeared 12,000 years ago. But there's one alignment that doesn't match any known celestial object, pointing to a region of space where nothing significant is visible. Where? Reeves asked. Yilmaz pulled out a star chart marked with calculations. The ecliptic south pole below the plane of the solar system. The pillars aligned to point towards something that would have been in that direction 12,000 years ago. Something important enough to memorialize in stone, but nothing we can identify today. Monroe and Reeves exchanged glances. The ecliptic south pole. The direction from which something might approach if it was coming from outside the solar system, or from a highly inclined orbit that took it far above or below the plane where the planets travel. That means someone brought it here, Monroe said after they'd left the cafe and were walking through Shanlufa's bustling streets. The Anunnaki, or whoever they actually were, they used manufactured materials. They had technology sophisticated enough to leave traces that last 12,000 years, and they built monuments aligned to point toward where they came from. Reeves was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. The tablets weren't offerings to gods. They were logs, records, an archive of what they did here, who they were, where they came from, and someone is finding those records and classifying them because the information is still relevant today. But relevant how? Monroe asked. What could ancient genetic engineering and extraterrestrial visitors have to do with current government and corporate interests? They didn't have an answer yet, but they were about to find one. Ast 5, Genesis 2. Back in London. In early June, Monroe continued working her intelligence sources, looking for any connection between the suppressed archaeological discoveries and current scientific research. She was looking for organisations that might have an interest in ancient genetic information, in extraterrestrial materials, in anything that connected past and present in the way she was beginning to suspect. It took 6 weeks of careful investigation, following money trails through corporate filings and grant applications, tracing personnel movements between government agencies and private research facilities before she found the connection. Genesis 2. A classified research project launched in 2018 by a consortium that included biotech companies in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany and Japan, coordinated through government research agencies and funded by a mixture of public and private money hidden behind multiple layers of corporate structure. The project had a public face, occasionally mentioned in scientific journals and research publications. Officially, it was advanced genome editing research, building on CRISPR technology to develop treatments for genetic diseases. The papers describe sophisticated techniques for precisely modifying human DNA, correcting mutations that cause conditions like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, potentially addressing thousands of genetic disorders. Legitimate medical research, the kind that gets funding from major institutions and regulatory approval from ethics boards. The kind of work that wins Nobel Prizes and changes the future of medicine. But Monroe obtained leaked internal communications through a source she would never name. A whistleblower who'd been disturbed by what they'd seen inside the project and felt the public needed to know. The documents painted a very different picture of what Genesis 2 was actually doing. The project wasn't just fixing genetic defects, it was reverse engineering something ancient, using information extracted from Sumerian texts that had been translated by specialists working for Archangeo Solutions. One internal memo, dated March of 2022, laid it out clearly. Primary objective is not disease treatment but enhancement architecture. Using template sequences derived from recovered ancient genetic codices, cross-referenced with modern human genome mapping, we're identifying optimizations present in the original design that have degraded through evolutionary drift. Current protocols focus on neural efficiency, cellular regeneration capability, and lifespan extension through telomere integrity restoration. Another document described the source material. Cuneiform texts provided by Archon Bio Division contain remarkably detailed genetic instruction protocols, describable in modern terms as gene insertion sequences with specific ratio requirements. Text designates these as patterns set in clay, with binding pairs that encode various physiological traits. Direct correlation to chromosomal pair structure suggests source material authors possess sophisticated understanding of genetics. They weren't following mythology, they were following a recipe, instructions left behind by whoever created humans in the first place, now being decoded by scientists with the technology to understand what they were looking at. One file labelled Enki Protocol Primary Implementation outlined specific gene sequences being tested. The sequences were based on ratios described in ancient texts. 7 parts existing human genome to 3 parts modified sequence, introducing changes that enhance cognitive function, improved cellular repair mechanisms, extended natural lifespan, increased disease resistance. The scientific language was dense, full of technical terminology about protein synthesis and gene expression, and cellular signaling pathways. But the core concept was clear. Someone was attempting to recreate the Anunnaki's original work, to engineer humans according to an ancient template that had been preserved in cuneiform text for 45 centuries. One document contained a section that made Monroe's hands shake as she read it. Phase 1 trials completed successfully on 23 subjects. All binding pair modifications achieved stable integration. Subjects demonstrate enhanced cognitive processing, improved pattern recognition, extended concentration capability, physical health markers within acceptable ranges, no significant adverse effects observed. Proceeding to Phase 2 expansion to larger subject pool. 23 subjects, the same number of binding pairs mentioned in the ancient texts, The same number of chromosome pairs in the human genome, not coincidence. A deliberate correspondence, following the original design specifications. Another memo discussed the broader implications. If template sequences prove universally applicable across human populations, potential applications extend beyond medical treatment into augmentation territory. Military applications obvious, enhance soldiers with superior cognitive and physical capabilities. Economic applications significant, optimized workforce with reduced health costs and extended productive lifespan. Social engineering potential requires careful ethical consideration, but represents revolutionary capability for shaping human future. They weren't curing diseases, they were redesigning humanity according to ancient specifications left by whoever created us in the first place. And they were doing it under the cover of medical research, hidden behind classifications and corporate privacy, without public knowledge or democratic oversight. Monroe showed the documents to Reeves in late July. They met at a small flat she'd rented in East London under a false name, both of them increasingly paranoid about surveillance, after weeks of investigating organisations with significant resources and motivation to keep secrets. Reeves read through everything twice, his face growing paler as the implications sank in. They're not just studying ancient history, they're using it. They found instruction manuals for creating humans and they're following them. The Anunnaki weren't gods, Monroe said. They were genetic engineers. They came to Earth with specific purposes, modified existing primates to create a workforce suited to their needs, documented everything in records that survived as mythology. And now we've reached the point where we can understand those records and recreate their work. But why? Reeves asked. What's the purpose? If someone has the resources to do this, why hide it? Why not announce a breakthrough in genetic medicine and accept the accolades? Because it's not medicine, Monroe said. Or not just medicine. Look at the applications they're discussing. Military enhancement, workforce optimization, social engineering. They're talking about creating a new type of human, designed for specific purposes, just like the Anunnaki created us. Which makes us the gods this time, Reeves said slowly. We're doing to ourselves what was done to us, following the same pattern, repeating the cycle. Monroe pulled up one more document, the one that had disturbed her most. A progress report from April of 2024, just weeks after Reeves's dig at Eridu had been shut down. Eridu recovery operation successful. Additional genetic codices retrieved from sealed chamber, expanding template library significantly. New sequences under analysis, with particular focus on behavioural modification protocols and reproductive compatibility specifications, integration into Phase 3 planning underway. They'd gone back to Eridu after shutting down Reeves's excavation. They'd taken everything from the sealed chamber, all the information carved into those walls, and they were using it to advance their human redesign project. We have to expose this, Reeves said. We have to get this information public before they go too far. Monroe looked at him carefully. If we do that, we become major problems for very powerful people, organisations with government connections and corporate resources and no interest in having their work disrupted. I know, Reeves met her eyes. But if we don't, they keep going. They keep following ancient instructions to redesign humanity without consent, without oversight, without any consideration of what it means to fundamentally alter what humans are. Monroe nodded slowly. Then we need more evidence. Something irrefutable. Something that proves not just what they're doing, but what it's based on. We need to confirm that the Anunnaki were real, that their legacy is still active, that this isn't just mythology being misinterpreted by zealous scientists. The vault, Reeves said. The sealed chamber under Eridu. If we can get back there, if we can document what's actually in that chamber before Archon processes everything, we'll have evidence that connects past to present. That's incredibly dangerous. I know, but I have a contact in Iraq, someone from the original dig who might be able to help us get access. Monroe looked at the documents spread across the table, the evidence of a project that was redesigning human nature based on ancient genetic engineering specifications. When do we leave? Soon, Reeves said, before they finish Phase 3 and whatever they're planning next. They started planning their return to Iraq. They arranged for encrypted backups of all their evidence, distributed to multiple trusted sources, with instructions to release everything if they didn't check in regularly. They prepared cover stories and travel arrangements, keeping everything compartmentalized and careful. By early September, they were ready to go. That was when everything accelerated in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Ast 6. The Earthquake. On April 10th, 2024, just 6 days after Reeves's excavation was shut down, a minor earthquake struck near Basra in southern Iraq. Magnitude 4.2 on the Richter scale, centred about 15 kilometres west of the city. It was barely noticed internationally, just another small seismic event in a geologically active region. Local news reported minor damage to buildings, some cracked roads, no casualties. Standard earthquake, nothing unusual. Iraq sits near the collision zone between the Arabian and Eurasian tectonic plates, so small quakes happen regularly. This one was slightly larger than average, but nothing catastrophic. Except something else happened during that earthquake, something that wasn't widely reported at the time but would become significant later. A subterranean facility was partially exposed about 8 kilometres from the earthquake's epicentre. Construction workers building a new industrial complex had been excavating for foundation work when the ground collapsed, revealing tunnels and chambers that had been hidden under centuries of sediment. Local engineers were called in to assess the structural damage and make sure nothing would collapse further. The industrial site was near oil infrastructure, so any ground instability was a serious concern. The engineers rappelled down into the newly opened void to map its extent and determine whether the surrounding area was safe. What they found didn't match their expectations at all. The tunnels were old, clearly ancient, carved into bedrock with precision that seemed impossible for primitive technology. But they weren't rough or irregular like natural caves. They were engineered, with smooth walls that showed tooling marks, regular dimensions that suggested deliberate design, and a layout that implied purpose rather than random formation. The engineers followed the main tunnel for about 30 metres before it opened into a larger chamber. That's where they found something that made them stop their survey and immediately contact Baghdad. In the centre of the chamber sat a sphere roughly 3 metres in diameter, partially unearthed by the earthquake's disruption of the surrounding soil. It was made of a dark stone-like material, smooth and slightly reflective, covered in inscriptions similar to ancient cuneiform but more complex, more dense with information, carved in layers that suggested multiple rounds of inscription over time. And it was active. The engineers' radio equipment started malfunctioning as soon as they entered the chamber, producing static and interference that made communication difficult. Their measuring instruments showed erratic readings, electromagnetic fields that shouldn't exist around inert stone. One engineer had brought a handheld thermal camera, and when he pointed it at the sphere, it registered a clear thermal signature. Heat generation that had no apparent source. They retreated quickly and made their report. The Iraqi government responded within hours, sending specialists from multiple agencies, cordoning off the area and issuing immediate classification orders that made the discovery state secret. But some of the engineers had made recordings on their personal phones. Some of them had downloaded the instrument data before it was confiscated, and some of them were disturbed enough by what they'd found that they leaked information to friends and family, who shared it on social media, who sent it to researchers and journalists who might know what it meant. Monroe had sources monitoring Middle Eastern social media and obscure forums where leakers sometimes posted information. In late April, one of those sources flagged a series of posts from Iraqi accounts describing the discovery, including grainy cell phone videos that showed the sphere in its chamber. The government's official statement came quickly. Natural mineral formations exposed by the earthquake, unusual geological phenomena caused by groundwater interactions, nothing of concern, the site sealed for safety reasons. standard bureaucratic language designed to dismiss curiosity and discourage investigation. But the cell phone footage showed something else. The sphere's surface was clearly covered in intentional inscriptions, not natural formations. The electromagnetic readings were documented in photos of instrument displays, and one video, shot from just a few meters away before the engineers retreated, showed something extraordinary. The inscriptions on the sphere were glowing very faintly, a barely visible blue luminescence that pulsed in slow rhythm. The pulse was regular, occurring approximately every 2 seconds, constant and precise like a heartbeat. Monroe obtained more data through her sources, including copies of the official technical survey that had been classified but leaked by someone inside the Iraqi government. The survey was thorough and professional, conducted by competent engineers who knew their work. The electromagnetic readings were consistent and measurable, showing field strengths that varied from approximately 0.3 to 0.8 milligauss, pulsing in the same 2-second cycle visible in the glowing inscriptions. The thermal signature measured roughly 3 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature, again pulsing with the same rhythm. Most importantly, the spectroscopic analysis of the sphere's material showed it wasn't any kind of natural stone. It was a composite, layers of different materials fused together with precision that required sophisticated manufacturing. The outer layer contained high concentrations of iridium and platinum group metals in manufactured alloy ratios identical to what Yilmaz had found at Gobecli Tepe. Someone had built this thing using extraterrestrial materials, buried it kilometers underground in southern Iraq, and left it in a state where it could remain functional for thousands of years. If they built man in their image, Monroe's voice recorded in a memo she prepared in May, what if they left themselves a way to come back? What if this isn't a monument or a record? What if it's a beacon still transmitting after all this time, sending a signal to whoever put it here that Earth is still here, still occupied, still relevant? She and Reeves had added the Baqra discovery to their growing database of suppressed evidence, another piece of the pattern they were constructing. The timing was suspicious, occurring just days after the Residual excavation was shut down, in the same region, exposing technology that matched the evidence Reeves had found. And the fact that it was still active, still generating electromagnetic fields and thermal signatures after thousands of years, suggested engineering far beyond anything ancient humans should have been capable of creating. By the time Monroe and Reeves were planning their return to Iraq in early September, they'd accumulated evidence of multiple sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia where advanced technology had been found and classified, where genetic information had been preserved in texts that modern scientists were now decoding and using. They'd connected past to present, shown that the Anunnaki weren't mythology but preserved memory of something real, demonstrated that modern organizations with significant resources were following ancient instructions to redesign human genetics. But they still needed something that would convince skeptics, something that would break through the natural resistance to believing something so extraordinary. They needed direct evidence from the source, from the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. That's where they went in mid-September of 2024, using contacts and careful planning to slip past the security that Archon had established around the site, and that's where they vanished. Act 7. The Global Link. While Monroe and Reeves were investigating suppressed archaeological sites and classified genetic research, other patterns were emerging on a global scale that seemed unrelated at first, but fit disturbingly well into the larger picture they had been assembling. In July of 2024, NASA quietly censored portions of deep space infrared data collected by the James Webb Space Telescope. The data had been made available to researchers through standard channels, then was suddenly reissued with sections marked as corrupted or containing instrumentation errors that rendered them unreliable. This wasn't entirely unusual. Space telescope data sometimes contains artifacts from cosmic ray impacts or sensor glitches, and corrections are routine. But the scope of the censoring was significant, affecting multiple observation periods focused on the outer solar system, particularly data collected while the telescope was imaging regions near Jupiter and beyond. Several astronomers who had already downloaded the original uncorrected data noticed something interesting in the sections that were later marked as corrupted. The infrared reading showed gravitational anomalies, subtle perturbations in the orbital paths of trans-Neptunian objects that suggested gravitational influence from something massive in the outer solar system. Not Neptune, not Pluto, not any of the known dwarf planets or large Kuiper belt objects. Something else, something big enough to affect multiple orbits in measurable ways. The astronomers started comparing notes in private communications, trying to determine whether the anomalies were real or actually instrumental errors. The data was ambiguous enough that reasonable people could disagree, but there was enough signal there to be intriguing. One researcher, an astrophysicist at MIT named Jennifer Kowalski, ran simulations based on the anomaly data to estimate what kind of object could produce the observed effects. Her preliminary results suggested a large planet-sized body, possibly several times Earth's mass, in a highly elliptical orbit that took it far beyond Pluto for most of its cycle, but brought it into the inner solar system periodically. The orbital parameters she calculated matched, with uncomfortable precision, predictions that had been made decades earlier by Zecharia Sitchin, a controversial author who had written extensively about ancient Sumerian texts and their descriptions of the Anunnaki. Sitchin's work had been largely dismissed by mainstream academics as pseudoscience, misinterpretations of ancient texts combined with faulty astronomy and wishful thinking. He claimed that Sumerian texts described a planet called Nibiru, massive and distant, whose highly elliptical orbit brought it close to Earth approximately every 3,600 years. When Nibiru approached, according to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, the Anunnaki would return to Earth, checking on their creation, harvesting resources, maintaining their ancient installations. The texts supposedly described multiple return visits throughout history, corresponding to major transitions in human civilization, like the rise of Sumerian culture and the Bronze Age collapse. Mainstream science had rejected all of this. The astronomical predictions didn't match any observed objects, the textual interpretations were considered overly literal and selective, and the whole narrative was dismissed as ancient astronaut pseudoscience that distorted real archaeology and history. But now, Kowalski's analysis based on actual observational data was producing orbital parameters that closely matched Sitchin's predictions, at least in broad strokes. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to be disturbing. She posted her preliminary findings on a preprint server used by astronomers to share work before formal peer review. Within days, her paper was flagged and removed, marked as violating terms of service for promoting fringe theories without adequate scientific basis. Her NASA data access was suspended pending review of her research protocols, but several dozen researchers had already downloaded her paper and the supporting data. Some of them started their own analyses, tried to replicate her findings, looked for other evidence of gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system. The conversation spread through astronomical circles and spilled over into internet forums where amateur researchers and conspiracy theorists tracked evidence of official suppression and hidden knowledge. People started mapping Sitchin's predicted orbit against current planetary positions, calculating when a hypothetical Nibiru might be making its closest approach if it actually existed. The estimates varied depending on assumptions about orbital parameters, but most converged on a time frame in the mid to late 2020s, meaning now or very soon, meaning that if something was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, it might already be close enough to detect if anyone with access to good telescopes was looking in the right direction. Monroe had been tracking these developments through her network of sources, adding them to the overall picture she and Reeves were building. The astronomical data by itself wasn't conclusive, could easily be explained away as instrumental errors or misinterpretation of ambiguous measurements. But combined with everything else, with suppressed archaeological evidence and classified genetic research and ancient texts describing cyclic returns of the Anunnaki, it formed a pattern that was harder to dismiss. If Nibiru was real, if something massive was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, then what Monroe had asked in one of her notes became urgently relevant. What if the Anunnaki are already preparing Earth to receive them? She'd obtained one more document that tied everything together in ways that chilled her to read. A leaked memo from Archon Geo Solutions dated August of 2024, marked with classification levels that suggested it had been distributed only to senior personnel with specific clearances. The memo was brief, bureaucratic in tone, discussing project status in neutral technical language. Phase 3 genomic synchronization complete. Population markers within acceptable variance across target demographics. Template stability confirmed through 6-month monitoring of Phase 2 cohort. Neural enhancement protocols demonstrate sustained efficacy with no degradation. Cellular regeneration improvements holding stable. Awaiting return signal for Phase 4 implementation. Return signal. As if someone was expected to send a message. As if someone was coming back and would need certain preparations to have been completed before their arrival. Phase 4 was mentioned but not detailed in the memo Monroe had obtained, marked as classified above the document's security level. But the implication was clear. Genesis 2 had multiple phases planned, with each phase building toward some ultimate objective that required human populations to meet specific genetic criteria before implementation. If the Anunnaki were real, if they'd created humanity for specific purposes through genetic engineering, and if they were returning, then Phase 4 might be about ensuring their creations were ready, compatible, suitable for whatever purposes the Anunnaki had in mind, creating an interface, preparing a workforce, establishing compatibility between ancient genetic engineers and their modern redesigned product. Monroe had shared all of this with Reeves during their planning sessions before the Iraq trip, laying out the full scope of what they'd uncovered. The evidence was circumstantial, could be dismissed by skeptics as pattern matching and conspiracy thinking, but the pattern was consistent and the connections were documentable. "They're not coming back to check on us," Reeves had said after reading everything. "They're coming back to use us. We're a resource they created, a tool they left behind, and now they're making sure the tool is properly maintained and upgraded before they need it again." Which makes humanity what, Monroe had asked? Property, equipment, a biological technology they designed for specific purposes? Yes, Reeves said simply. And Genesis 2 is making sure we're functioning according to specifications, ready for whatever they have planned. That was the reality they were facing as they prepared to return to Iraq, to investigate the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. They weren't just uncovering ancient history anymore. They were documenting an ongoing operation that spanned thousands of years, from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building towards something that might be imminent if the astronomical data was accurate. Their last communication before entering Iraq was an encrypted video sent to Marcus Webb, the independent researcher Monroe trusted as a dead man's switch. If they didn't return, he was supposed to release everything they'd found, make it public regardless of the consequences. "We've confirmed the existence of a sealed vault under Eridu," Monroe said in the video, her face serious but calm. "The coordinates match the old texts exactly. We're going in tonight with a local contact. The Anunnaki never left. They went underground." Reeves added his own thoughts. "If we're right, everything changes. Human history, human origin, the entire narrative of where we come from and why we're here. This isn't archaeology anymore. This is contact." Then darkness, movement, the video ending. That was September 21st, 2024. Neither Monroe nor Reeves has been heard from since. Act 8. The last transmission. The final piece of evidence, the most controversial and hardest to verify, emerged 6 weeks after Monroe and Reeves vanished. In late October of 2024, a video file appeared on an encrypted server known for hosting leaked classified material, a dark web location that had previously published government documents and corporate secrets. The server was shut down within hours of the video appearing, taken offline through coordinated action by multiple governments, but not before several researchers managed to download the file and distribute copies through other channels. The video is grainy handheld footage, clearly shot on a consumer camera or phone in challenging conditions with minimal lighting. The timestamp in the corner is corrupted, showing random characters instead of actual date and time, but forensic analysis of the visual artifacts and compression patterns suggests it was recorded in late September of 2024, consistent with when Monroe and Reeves disappeared. The video begins with darkness and the sound of heavy breathing, footsteps on stone. Then dim light appears, provided by small LED flashlights that create harsh shadows and limited visibility. The camera pans across walls of carved stone, underground, clearly ancient. But these walls aren't ordinary archaeological remains. They're covered in inscriptions that glow faintly with blue luminescence, not from external illumination, but from within the carvings themselves, as if the stone had been treated with some kind of luminescent material, or as if the inscriptions themselves were generating light through some unknown process. The glow pulses slowly, rhythmically, getting slightly brighter and dimmer in cycles that last about 2 seconds each. The pattern is identical across all the walls, synchronized as if controlled by some central mechanism. Rachel Monroe's voice, recognizable from other recordings, though the audio quality is poor. This isn't a tomb, it's not a temple or a storage vault, it's a system, a machine that's been asleep for thousands of years. The camera continues panning, and the inscriptions pulse brighter as the lens passes over them. The patterns are extraordinarily complex, layered information encoded in visual form, some characters recognizable as variations on Sumerian cuneiform, but others completely unknown, geometric and precise in ways that suggest mathematical or technical notation rather than linguistic meaning. "It's reacting to us," Reeves's voice says from behind the camera, tense with excitement or fear or both. "Our presence, our bioelectric fields, something. It's waking up. We're activating something that hasn't been active in millennia." The camera focuses on the centre of the chamber, showing a raised circular platform about 4 meters in diameter. The platform is made of the same glowing stone as the walls, with inscriptions arranged in concentric circles radiating from a depression in the exact centre. The depression is shaped vaguely like a handprint, but with 7 distinct contact points instead of 5, arranged in a pattern that doesn't match human anatomy. Each contact point is about 3 centimeters deep, smooth-sided, clearly intentional. Monroe moves into frame, approaches the platform carefully, examining the depression without touching it. "This is an interface," she says, "a control mechanism, but designed for something with different hands than humans, different number of digits, different proportions." "Don't touch it," Reeves says from behind the camera. "We don't know what it does, what it might activate." "I'm not going to," Monroe says, but she leans closer, examining the inscriptions around the depression. These symbols, they're instructions, sequential steps for operating something, and they reference the timing, the cycles, the return of... Oh God! Suddenly a low-frequency hum fills the audio, deep enough that it's probably felt more than heard, vibrating through the stone and the air, resonating in frequencies that make the camera shake slightly even though Monroe's hands are steady. The inscriptions on the walls brighten significantly, the blue glow intensifying and spreading through the carved channels like liquid flowing through irrigation canals, filling in patterns that weren't visible before, lighting up in sequence as if energy was moving through specific pathways. The hum increases in pitch and intensity, becoming almost musical, overtones harmonizing in ways that sound deliberately arranged, mathematically precise. The light flows toward the ceiling, concentrating on a central point directly above the platform where the walls curve to meet. The symbols arrange themselves into a configuration, a specific pattern that wasn't visible before when the inscriptions were inactive. The image is familiar, iconic even. The winged disc, the symbol seen on countless Sumerian tablets and Babylonian monuments. The representation of the Anunnaki's divine authority. But here it's not carved or painted. It's formed by light, by active energy, by a system that's functioning after being dormant for an incomprehensible length of time. The wings spread across the ceiling, geometric and regular, the central disc glowing brighter than the surrounding symbols, pulsing faster now, 4 or 5 times per second. "Oh God," Monroe's voice says, backing away from the platform. "We activated it. Marcus, if you're seeing this, we activated the beacon. We found the interface, and just being here, just entering this chamber, was enough to wake it up. They know we're here, they know we've found it. The system is transmitting." The light continues intensifying, the hum growing louder and more complex, layers of frequency stacking on each other in patterns that suggest information encoding, data transmission, a signal being sent through some medium that isn't apparent. The camera jerks as Reeves starts moving, backing toward what must be the entrance to the chamber. "We need to leave. We need to document this and get out before someone notices. If Arkan is monitoring this area, they'll know the beacon activated." But Monroe doesn't move immediately. She's staring at the ceiling, at the glowing winged disc, transfixed by what she's seeing. "It's not a warning," she says quietly, almost to herself. "It's an invitation. The beacon isn't saying stay away, it's saying we're ready. We're ready for you to come back." The video cuts to black abruptly, leaving only audio. Sound of rapid breathing, footsteps on stone echoing in enclosed space, the hum still audible, but starting to fade as they move away from the chamber. Monroe's voice one more time, distant and echoing. The inscriptions describe the timing. 43 cycles since the beginning, each cycle 3,600 years. That's roughly 155,000 years since they first came. But the beacon triggers when humans reach sufficient development to find it and activate it. We just told them we're ready for the next phase. Then nothing. Static hiss of dead audio. The file ends. Conclusion. The pattern complete. So what does all of it mean? What are we supposed to do with this information? Let's lay out what we know, what can be documented, what's supported by leaked evidence and suppressed research that can be traced and verified by anyone willing to do the work. Multiple archaeological sites across the Middle East have yielded discoveries suggesting advanced knowledge that predates known human civilization. These discoveries have been systematically classified or suppressed by government agencies and private contractors acting in coordination. The pattern is consistent. Discovery, documentation, shutdown, silence. Eridu, Harran, Tel Brak, Susa, and others all following the same sequence. Ancient texts from Sumerian, Akkadian, and related cultures describe the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities with technical knowledge, who created humans through processes that read like genetic engineering when translated carefully and literally. The texts specify ratios, binding pairs, sequential procedures that correlate with modern genetic science in ways that shouldn't be possible for ancient writers working with primitive understanding. Modern genetic research programs, classified and operating under cover of medical research, are using information extracted from these ancient texts to modify human genetics according to ancient template specifications. The Genesis 2 project exists, its documentation is real, and its objectives include human enhancement based on ancient genetic codices recovered from archaeological sites. Astronomical observations suggest possible gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system, consistent with a large planetary body in a highly elliptical orbit, though the data is ambiguous enough that reasonable skepticism is warranted. The orbital parameters loosely match ancient predictions about a wandering planet that returns periodically. Underground installations have been discovered in Iraq containing technology that shouldn't exist. devices made from manufactured extraterrestrial alloys that remain functional after thousands of years of burial, transmitting signals or maintaining readiness for purposes unknown. That's the documented reality, the evidence that exists regardless of how we interpret it. The skeptical explanation remains available. Coincidence, misinterpretation, pattern matching by investigators who wanted to find connections and therefore found them. The ancient texts of mythology being overinterpreted. The genetic research is legitimate medical science, with connections to archaeology being exaggerated. The astronomical data is instrumental error. The underground technology is misidentified natural formations or modern installations mistaken for ancient ones. Everything could be explained away if you're committed to conventional narratives and uncomfortable with extraordinary possibilities. But what if it's not? What if every piece of evidence is genuine? What if the Anunnaki were real, physical beings who came to Earth from somewhere else, who understood genetics and engineering in ways that seemed like magic to primitive humans who witnessed their work, who created humanity for specific purposes through deliberate modification of existing species? Then the implications reshape everything we think we know about ourselves. Human history isn't what we've been taught. We're not the product of purely natural evolution, or at least not entirely. We're designed, engineered, created by beings with capabilities far beyond what our ancestors could comprehend. Those beings documented their work in texts that survived as mythology, preserved through countless retellings and translations because the information was too important to lose completely. They left installations, buried technology, monitoring systems that could remain dormant for thousands of years and reactivate when the right conditions were met. The conditions being humans developed enough to find the installations, understand what they were looking at, and trigger the systems that would signal our creators that we'd reached sufficient sophistication. We call them myths because it's easier than calling them memories. Because accepting them as memories means accepting that everything we think we know about human origin and human nature might be incomplete at best, deliberately obscured at worst. It means accepting that we might not be alone in the universe, and that we never have been. That we're part of something larger, an operation that spans thousands of years from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building toward purposes we're only beginning to comprehend. And the scariest part? We might have just activated the signal that tells them to come back. The sealed chamber under Eridu exists. The inscriptions are real, carved by people with knowledge that predates any known civilization. The beacon, if that's what it is, was dormant until human investigators entered that space and triggered systems that had been waiting for exactly that moment. Monroe and Reeves found it. They activated it. They documented what happened and sent one final message before vanishing. Were they captured by Archon personnel monitoring the site? Are they being held somewhere, prevented from revealing what they discovered? Are they dead? Casualties of knowing too much and threatening powerful interests that want this information suppressed? Or are they somewhere else entirely? Somewhere underground in chambers lit by blue circuits carved in ancient stone, waiting with whatever they found there for the signal to be answered, for the creators to return and complete whatever plan has been unfolding since the beginning. The Eridu excavation remains officially sealed, classified under a multinational directive that hasn't been explained or justified to anyone outside the agencies involved. Archon Geo Solutions continues operating in Iraq, their activities hidden behind corporate privacy and government classification, their purpose known only to senior personnel with appropriate clearances. Genesis 2 continues its work, publishing occasional papers about genetic medicine, while pursuing objectives that remain classified, following ancient instructions to redesign humanity according to specifications left by our creators. And something might be approaching from the outer solar system, massive and distant, following an orbit that brings it close to Earth on a schedule measured in thousands of years, close enough to matter, close enough to allow whoever or whatever created us to return and check on their work. Daniel Reeves and Rachel Monroe remain missing. Officially, there's no evidence of foul play, no reason to suspect anything beyond two adults choosing to disappear. Their families still hope they'll come home. Investigators have found nothing. Officially, nothing unusual happened in Iraq in 2024. Officially, the Anunnaki are mythology, ancient stories told by primitive people trying to make sense of a confusing world. Officially, humanity evolved naturally through millions of years of random mutation and natural selection. No intervention required, no outside influence needed to explain our consciousness or capabilities. Officially, we're alone. We've always been alone. And the gods who shaped us from clay are nothing more than stories. But late at night, when you're drifting off to sleep, when the rational mind loosens its grip and older instincts surface, maybe you'll wonder. Maybe you'll think about the winged disc carved on tablets 5,000 years old, glowing in underground chambers that haven't been opened in millennia. Maybe you'll think about the impossible precision of ancient structures, the sophisticated knowledge encoded in cuneiform that nobody should have possessed, the stories every civilization tells about gods who came from the sky and made humans in their image. Maybe you'll look up at the stars and wonder what's out there in the dark, beyond Neptune and Pluto, in the cold reaches where orbits take thousands of years to complete. Maybe you'll wonder if something is coming closer, making its slow, inevitable approach toward the inner solar system, toward the planet where its creation waits. Maybe you'll wonder if we were designed to wonder, if curiosity itself is part of the program, if every question we ask brings us closer to the answers they left for us to find when we were finally sophisticated enough to understand them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realise that the beacon has already been activated, that the signal has already been sent, that we've announced ourselves to whoever created us, told them we've reached the development level they were waiting for, triggered the systems they left to monitor our progress. The Anunnaki aren't coming back. They're already here. They've always been here, waiting in chambers beneath Eridu and Gobecli Tepe, and a dozen other sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia, sleeping in technology we mistake for ancient stone, encoded in the very DNA that makes us human, preserved in texts we dismissed as mythology for thousands of years, waiting for us to be ready, waiting for us to find them, waiting for us to fulfill whatever purpose they designed us for when they shaped the clay and called it human, and set us on a path that led inevitably to this moment. Phase 4 is coming. The return signal has been sent, and we're about to discover what we were actually created. For all those thousands of years ago, when beings from somewhere else decided Earth needed a workforce designed to specifications they could control, sweet dreams.